The story of the main character, stunning in its shocking events, begins on that night when rain was dripping from the sky, and in the dark city, windows were sometimes lit up, which looked even more frightening. But one noble lady hurried to come to such a place, who was already descending from her own luxurious carriage to the ground and in such nasty weather, because she came here with a specific purpose, for which she put on dark clothes and the same shoes. The girl with the black cape and hood on her head looked only forward, while next to her was the servant, bowing to her, who had helped her down earlier, also who was clearly expecting something special this night. The fact is that it was not some woman from the aristocracy who came to the slums, but a lady known to many in these parts by the name of Stacy, who looked at the poor buildings when her own knight bowed to her. In a stern voice, Stacy ordered her subordinate to show the way to some important thing, which is why the first to break the silence was Mrs. Stacy's guide, who with a sly smile confessed to her that he wanted to boast that he had been looking for a certain girl for a very long time, and he also asked why the aristocrat needed this particular child. However, he didn't even have time to say anything further because Stacy's guard immediately grabbed a sword in his hand and put its blade to the man's throat, ordering him to be silent. After this, the guide began to nervously look around, and when he managed to find the right girl, he pointed his finger somewhere to the side with a joyful, crazy face, shouting to God that he had found the very girl she was looking for. The aristocrat immediately looked where the stranger was pointing, and she really saw a child among the broken old buildings who was outside in terrible weather and sitting on her knees. Taking a closer look at the child, Stacy realized that she had found what she had come here for, because the girl had amazing golden hair that shone even in the smallest light, and the little girl herself was holding something in her hand. And the guide, who intended to quickly profit from finding the girl for the lady, turned to the aristocrat with a smile on his face and admitted that it had been very difficult for him to find. And after that, Stacy, as if realizing that the man wanted money from her, threw a bag of gold coins at his feet. And when he rejoiced, the guide waved goodbye to the lady and told her that he would do just that, after which he smiled at Stacy and was about to leave, before wishing the aristocrat good health and good luck in everything. But when the stranger walked away and gradually turned into a human silhouette due to the distance, and the guard put his fist to his heart, bowed to the lady and told her that he would do everything as she said, so that the guy who found out about the girl would no longer be able. After that, the lady already wanted to approach the unknown girl with enchanting golden hair, who was crying in the rain and getting wet more and more, but still remained on the street as if she had been kicked out. The girl was crying and scraping a piece of wood with another tool, while Stacy silently approached her and already knew that in front of her was not just a homeless beauty, but a girl named Camellia. The lady knew that Camellia was a precious metal, passed through rubbish and trash, and with such thoughts she approached her when the rain only intensified and asked the beauty what he was doing. And then the girl, who had not only magical golden hair but also a sweet face with crystal green eyes, though tired. Hearing this, the aristocrat smiled, looking at the blonde lady and asking her if her name was Camellia, which made the little girl even more surprised. Then Mrs. Stacy looked at the girl and smiled at her as if she had already thought of something in her head, but she also answered the girl that she actually knew her very well, which she could brag about. But these words did not please the little main character, but only frightened. The lady actually knows the girl herself and even her mother, because several years ago a pregnant woman of incredible beauty arrived here in search of a new home, and that is why she ran through the streets, intending to find new walls for herself, because most likely she was kicked. And for a long time this same woman was homeless, went from house to house and asked for bread, and also slept among the homeless, where they squeezed and pressed her to the corner, trembling with fear as if in fact someone was pursuing her and wanted to find her as soon as possible. And the real shock was when, among this devastation, she gave birth to a girl. The baby lady turned out to be unlike the sleeping one, because the child had an unusual fair-haired appearance, as well as green crystal eyes, with which the girl cried and looked at her own mother. But everything did not turn out as in a fairy tale, because soon the harvest time came, and after that a cold winter, because of which it snowed around the clock, and the mountains gradually turned white. And when the little lady cried, sometimes left without a mother with illness, the girl's mother realized that she needed to get expensive medicine for her child, And for this, she sold her body to the doctor for the first. Now, when the girl is 12 years old, Mrs. Stacy stands before her and looks at the little girl with a sly smile, suddenly admitting that she knows that her mother is terminally ill. And she said it so that, having heard such shocking news, because her mother is the only important and dear person in her life, the golden-haired girl immediately threw herself at the feet of the lady with the dark cape and hood, asking her in shock what she was sick with and how badly. But this did not touch Stacy one bit, but only angered her, because she saw the beauty. Tears were already welling up in her eyes, and she anxiously clutched the train of the noble lady's dress with her hands, asking her what she should do now, because her mother was incredible. The girl, shocked by the mistress's words, already wanted to run with all her might towards one house where her mother was. But the little lady did not suspect that the aristocrat would not let her leave so easily, but would do something that would forever change the fate of the poor girl. The fact is that the girl felt a blow to her neck of such force that she was immediately amazed and fell silent, slipped, and was preparing to fall to the ground from helplessness, realizing that everything turned out to. The aristocrat's guard did not let her fall. He immediately caught the girl with his hand, and when she lost consciousness, he could have taken her to himself and kidnapped her. And Stacy herself at this time did not even have emotions of regret or sadness, because this is exactly what she was trying to achieve, looking at the unconscious girl with burning and terrible, indifferent eyes. The guard was already lifting the girl into his arms, looking at the lady and telling her that she was too weak and defenseless for her 12 years, because now, wearing only a light, decrepit dress, completely soaked from the rain, she would definitely get sick. But the lady only turned away from her guard and went to the carriage, telling the man with displeasure that she didn't like unnecessary noise and therefore asked him to hire people to clean everything up here and clear away traces. And when the guard asked the lady whether they should also deal with the mother of the little beauty, Mrs. Stacy turned to him with angry and furious eyes, asking him from afar what he thought would happen with the fire during the rain. After this, the lady smirked at the guy and said that she was just joking, and then turned her back on him and answered directly that she only hoped that the girl's mother herself would die soon due to poor health. And now she was suggesting that they leave and hurry to the palace. And at that time, the unconscious girl had no idea that what awaited her was not just separation from her beloved mother, but a farewell to the slums and poverty, because she was. Only after this did the guard follow Stacy and silently held the girl in his arms while the lady walked in front of him and also did not say anything, thinking that she had successfully carried out her plan, and now she needed to finish the job. The next day, when the clear morning came, Kamalia was already gradually waking up and felt the incredibly soft bed, which surprised her with its aroma and comfort, because the girl had never lain on it. But suddenly, when the lady heard an unfamiliar voice of a woman right next to her calling her, she jumped up and looked at the dark-haired maid in front of her, who was also frightened by the sudden awakening. And when the maid anxiously asked the girl if everything was okay, the golden-haired beauty herself looked with surprise and curiosity at the room in which she woke up, because it was bright and so rich that she was afraid to move. The surprised girl with green eyes looked at the beautiful interior and asked the maid with delight if she had gone to heaven, which made the maid smile at first, realizing that the woman with brown hair pulled back into a bun just stroked the blonde girl's head and told her that she knew that she was probably very hungry, and therefore suggested that she first eat a hearty meal and then resolve all issues. After some time, the main character really found herself sitting on the bed, where she was already looking at the dish in front of her in surprise, while the maid warned her that everything was hot. But most of all, the lady with golden hair was worried. She sat on the floor and with her head down remembered that the beautiful lady had told her yesterday that her mother was sick, urgently, which is why the little girl was worried about her mother, wanting to see her as soon as possible, because the excitement in her soul had not died down since that night. The lady's sad mood was also noticed by the maid, who looked at her with regret and sympathy, and asked why she was not eating and whether she was hungry at all. The girl even approached the maid and began to ask where her beloved mother was now, and where was the beautiful lady who had approached her in the rain last night, and the maid could not answer all the questions. She just smiled sweetly and told the girl that the gentleman would come to her when the little girl had time to take a bath. But the surprised heroine asked what she meant, because it seemed she had never heard of what bathing procedures were. But, as it turned out, the girl with golden hair looked at the maid with surprised eyes for the reason that she did not understand why she was being prepared for something and washed before the mistress's arrival. Before the maid even had time to say a few words, the door of the room swung open with such force and suddenness that the girl looked at it in surprise. Not understanding who the boy with the beautiful voice entered the room in his expensive leather shoes, while the maid, Betty, replied that she did not have time for this, but still asked the master for forgiveness for this. And in front of her, the stunned Gurnia noticed a boy who looked very much like her, with golden hair and green eyes, who smiled at her and glowed like the sun, telling Kamalia that he was very glad to see her. He put his hand on his chest and with a smile told the girl that his name was Kieran Bale, and he also confessed that he heard that she was 12 years old, which is after that, the boy sat down next to the heroine on the bed and with a smile began to tell the baby that he would be 15 this year, which meant he was 3 years older than her, and therefore there was no need to be embarrassed in front of him. And even after 2 minutes, the golden-haired girl could not say a few words to the young aristocrat, but only moved away from him a couple of steps, pressing her knees from. Kieran looked at him with defeat on her face as the girl in front of him didn't even want to talk, but only shook with fear and whispered asking the fry to return her to her mother, whom she loved so much. But in response, Kieran smiled warmly and kindly, telling the girl that he already knew that she was sad for her mother, and therefore wanted to calm her down as soon. And when the maid began to be embarrassed and confused and stutter, trying to utter a word, the green-eyed girl cried and looked at the maid, feeling hopelessness, loneliness, and sadness. And only the golden-haired beauty was surprised when she heard from the maid that she was only ordered to prepare a bath and food for the little lady, which amazed Kamalia, remembering that she also needed to undergo. At that moment, the lady looked more closely at her hand and realized that the truth was incredibly dirty, and even dirty scratch. The girl shrank even more and pressed her dirty hands to herself because she was ashamed to be in such a state in front of the aristocrat. And she also quietly asked Kieran if she could wash herself right now. Hearing this, the maid immediately became happy and grabbed the girl by the hand, telling her that she could of course wash herself, and she could eat a little later. But before the main character had time to leave the room with the maid, she heard terrible, loud sounds behind her, which caused goosebumps to run through her body, and she turned around, wanting to see Kieran. Turning around, the main character noticed with horror that Kieran was not only coughing as if he had a cold, but was also shaking all over. But what struck the girl even more was that when the maid approached the master and tried to lift him to his feet to help him or take him somewhere, she noticed that he was all covered in blood, which had spread in spots over his clothes and even on. The strong cough and the terrible picture struck the main character so much that she froze, trying to get back to reality. But then she felt only emptiness around her and darkness. And then the girl looked at the sick Kieran, who continued to cough up blood, while servants circled around him and gave him towels, ordering others to quickly call a doctor before the weak boy became completely ill. Around the girl there were servants and maids running in different directions, and they all seemed to have forgotten about the fair-haired heroine, which is why she simply stood in the middle of the room and peered into the appearance of Kieran, who struck her with his terrible illness. And in the end, the main character looked with devastation and sadness as Kieran had to be carried on a stretcher in a hurry, trying to move him along a long corridor to another room. But she was even more struck by the words of the little girl, who already at that age knew what death was, and therefore pulled Betty by the train of her dress, asking if Kieran would leave the world of the living, which made the little girl. And the maid decided to calm her down, leaning over a little and smiling and saying that of course this was not true, and Kieran was not dying, but the little girl was still afraid, asking. Betty decided to take the girl's hand with a smile and hint to her about the bath they wanted to take together, as if she really wanted to distract the girl from her terrible thoughts by telling her that if they continued to stand around doing. As a result, the main character was already walking hand in hand with a woman she barely knew, who was going to lead her from the bedroom down the hallway and straight to the bathroom, which was something that was troubling the little girl. The thing is that the heroine was looking at a bright and scary large bloodstain, which frightened the protagonist more and more with each passing minute, and because of which the girl wondered what Kieran was sick with, whether it could be cured. And even when the door closed, the little girl did not take her eyes off the red spot on the large and well-kept bed, which did not mean anything good. But because of it, and after some time, the main character found herself with a maid named Betty in front of wide and dark doors, as if she was going to find the strength and determination to open them and enter an unknown room. What frightened the little girl more was that the maid seemed to address the one who was in the room itself, turning to the mistress and telling her that she had brought the girl to her, which caused Camelia to squeeze the palm with which she held Betty's hand, not knowing what to expect. As soon as the door opened, the little girl and the maid saw the same Mrs. Stacy on the red sofa, who had previously kidnapped the main character. And that time, the first to greet the lady was the child. Or rather, the fair-haired Camelia bowed her head to the woman and wished her all the best, showing the aristocrat her cute white and pink dress, which Betty had dressed her in after her bath. Her improved appearance was also noticed by Stacy, who looked at her with indifference and arrogance, admitting that now she looks much better than before. When the girl was complete. After that, the girl thanked the lady for the delicious food that she had been fed earlier. But when Camelia admitted that she wanted to see her mother most of all, a chill seemed to run through Stacy's body, and everything around her darkened with anxiety. And the lady's silence frightened the main character so much that she also fell silent, not even trying to look at the aristocrat, but only clutching the train of her cute dress with her. Only a couple of minutes later, the lady extended her hand to the girl with a smile and thus ordered the little one to come closer to her. But the golden-haired Camelia was more afraid of Stacy, and only after 2 minutes the girl decided to slowly walk towards the lady and sit down next to her, and the aristocrat took her hand in hers, looking at her as if she wanted to tell her something important. This turned out to be true, because the golden-haired girl looked at Stacy with shock and numbness, who immediately apologized to her and admitted that in fact she would never see her mother again, which made the child. Imagining the silhouette of a woman running away from her, Stacy said that she was very sorry for the reason that her mother had committed a terrible crime, or rather, had stolen something very valuable. Hearing this, the girl with golden hair and green eyes looked at the lady and seemed not to believe her words, looking at her with alarm and shock and saying that this could not be, because her mother had always been the best and most beloved for her. But while the girl was getting more and more worried and thinking about whether this was true and what would happen next, the aristocrat with blue eyes and an overly satisfied smile on her face, the girl cried and understood that she was in a hopeless situation, helpless for everyone around her, while the aristocrat stroked her cheek and consoled her, telling her that the thing that her mother. Stacy's kindness and regret changed so quickly that the protagonist was frightened and seemed about to lose her voice, because the lady suddenly smiled and with crazy eyes asked the girl. The girl became really nervous and started crying, trying to fix the situation with her words. Then she looked at the lady and told her that maybe she could get back what she had lost, and maybe her mother hadn't stolen anything. When they both sat down on the red sofa, talking in complete silence about important things, or rather, the golden-haired girl once again told the noble woman that her mother was not a thief, which made the lady. The blue-eyed girl with the braid looked at the main character's appearance and said that she had something to think about, which it seemed she did for a moment, until an idea arose in her head, for which she needed to call Betty. With a slight wave of her hand, the lady ordered the maid, who was standing not far from them and who was shaking with fear, to come closer to her and present them with what they needed. Betty silently approached the little girl and her mistress, who were sitting on the sofa, and put a certain box on the coffee table, which interested the heroine, who was already surprised and amazed by all the events. And taking out sharp golden scissors from the box, which frightened the protagonist even more, the lady with a crazy smile looked at the girl and said that from this moment on, her name is Camelius, and she is not a girl, but a boy. Also, when the moon was shining outside the window and the woman and the girl continued to sit in the office, Stacy told the little girl that now she would not only be a boy, but also had to continue to live as her son, so that nothing terrible would happen to her mother and her. And immediately after this, the lady began to cut off the girl's golden locks with scissors and wished for them to be shorter, saying that she thought she would look good with short hair. The sound of the scissors frightened the girl so much that she looked at her mistress with wide eyes, while the aristocrat with a smile on her face was already. Little by little, large locks of hair fell onto the floor and the sofa, and the girl, shocked by such an event, remained silent, realizing that she had to obey and after the girl's beautiful long hair was lost, and the mistress ordered Betty to take the girl to her room, the main character sat on the bed and withdrew into herself when the maid sat next. A girl named Betty told the little girl with sadness and regret that her mother was not killed or even touched because she was now being treated for an illness, and Mrs. Stacy. However, as soon as Betty said the name of the girl's mother, named Laura, and said that the only way to save Laura was to obey, the girl turned to the maid in surprise and asked her. But when the maid confessed to the girl that she was now in her father's house, The girl was finally surprised and fell silent, looking at the woman with defeat and asking her if this was true. And in order to find answers to her questions, the main character decided to examine the room in more detail with open lips and emotions of defeat. The thing is that the girl noticed a huge portrait on the wall, on which was painted a blonde man, an aristocrat, who, the maid began to tell the protagonist that she had the same golden hair as her father, and she also imagined how Camelia's mother combed the little lady's hair in front of the mirror. And when Betty told the girl that she was his exact copy, the girl with green eyes looked at the portrait as if everything in her life had turned upside down, which in fact is true, and the baby even stopped crying. Looking at the reflection in the door, in which the girl saw herself, like two peas in a pod similar to her short-haired father, she realized that the maid was not lying, but she still wasn't so happy about it, because it meant that the baby really wouldn't be able to escape from here. And her mother, who ran away from something in her youth, turned out to be the lover of an aristocrat, and their love gave birth to the girl. The girl, Aozu Kodo, had a lot of questions about what he was and what would happen next, but in the end she decided to sleep, staying in a large multi-story castle with a red roof, and in the palace itself, as well as on the street, there was work, because the maids were washing clothes near the shore and soaking sheets in the water, while talking about a variety of things, including the new guest in their palace. The first to speak about the protagonist was a girl with neatly combed light hair, who looked at her friends and asked if they had seen the child that Mrs. Stacy. Then another maid told everyone that there was a rumor that this child was the illegitimate child of the Lord himself, but no one understood why he was brought into the family. And then the girl explained that Kieran was very ill and therefore they needed a worthy heir so that no one would look down. Imagining a little boy in her head who is actually a girl named Camellia, the maid told her friends that Stacy had already prepared a shitty heir to the throne in case their legitimate son was incredibly. But at that time, they did not suspect at all that right next to them they would be able to see the little heir and the new man in the palace. Because Hot Betty was walking with him in the garden, the maid in the dark dress led the little boy by the hand in silence, while the protagonist was also silent, and the maids not far from them admired the boy. But when they took a closer look at the face of the sweet boy, which was incredibly beautiful, bright, and sweet, meanwhile the couple was already walking around the garden and looking at different bushes and trees. But suddenly the girl in the role of a fry lowered her head and said to the maid that this pal, and the golden-haired lady continued to walk with her head down, while Betty told her that her lessons would be held in Lord Kieran's chambers, so she needed to remember the whole way from her bedroom to her brother's office. But to this, the girl replied that she. In response, Betty only knelt down in front of the girl and squeezed the child's shoulders with her hands, telling her that she was the daughter of Lord Gillard, and therefore she was obliged to learn. Remembering her new last name, Bale, the little girl also remembered how she couldn't fall asleep for a long time last night. In addition to looking at her dad, Proacnoiska looked at the portrait of her dad and was already thinking that perhaps her mother had stolen not a thing, as Stacy herself had previously said, but something more. And now the girl lowered her head and told the maid that she couldn't imagine her life here, because it was hard for her to be here, including the fact that this. Betty looked at the baby and was already reaching out to touch her cheek, while the golden-haired girl asked the lady if her dad would let her go if she did everything he said. But the maid, already understanding that the lady would never be able. That's why she lied, looking at the lady with a smile and telling her that of course it was all true, because Mrs. Stacy was actually a very kind woman, although she only seemed evil and strict. They continued walking along the path, and the maid smiled and told the child that her dad would soon return from the server. I remember that he had finished all his political affairs, and when he returned home, he would be glad to see his children and her as well. The girl could not answer this, so she only looked at the luxurious garden of the palace, which was strewn with bright rosebuds and a variety of flowers. And nearby there was a gazebo, and the girl with green eyes looked at the beautiful gardens, the luxurious house, and the servants who passed by them, realizing that this place was different from the city in which she grew up and in which. But suddenly the main character's thoughts were interrupted by an incredibly loud sound of a shot, which made her cover her ears, shuddering in fear and not understanding. As it turned out, there was also another boy in the garden who was practicing shooting with a real gun, because when the girl looked to the side, she saw the hands of the little gentleman, who was holding a gun in his hands with his finger already on the. The lady was truly amazed when she saw not only the weapon, but also the person who owned it, because it turned out to be a hand. Even when the boy looked back at the child, whom he was seeing for the first time, the girl did not turn away from him, but only looked at him with surprise and interest, because she had hardly seen anything like this before. But when the unfamiliar guy was also looking into the main character's face, behind him suddenly appeared a cheerful and happy Kieran, who waved his hand. The protagonist just lowered her head down in embarrassment and awkwardness, while Kieran was telling the girl that he was glad that his brother had finally left the room, because he had been very worried about him before. But the girl did not expect at all that Kieran, whom she had known only for a couple of days, would not only be glad to see her, but would also hug the lady so tightly. After this, Kieran wanted to introduce his brother to his friend in the name of Claude, telling him that his name was Camelius. But at that time, However, the girl decided to look at the brunette named Claude at the moment when the boy himself came closer to her and addressed her as if she were a child, confessing that they were. But immediately after Claude said his words, he turned around and silently walked away from the girl, while the Pretinoise herself looked at him with a shkoom, and her older brother wondered if his younger brother was hungry. If he was hungry for. Camelia never answered her brother because she was too much infatuated with Claude, who at that time had already picked up his gun and was preparing for a new shot, continuing to learn the art of hunting or fighting. Claude, noticing that Camelia was looking at him, looked back at her and pointed his finger at his ear, as if hinting that she needed to cover her ears, because a loud shot could deafen her, especially if she. But the girl, who seemed to be seeing a man with a gun in front of her for the first time, did not understand Claude's hints, so she continued to look at the guy with confusion and tilted her head to the side. Then Claude, a handsome and older guy with beautiful blue eyes and black hair, looked at Kieran's supposedly younger brother and told him about the ears before shooting a second time. Immediately after this, the girl covered her ears with her hands and closed her eyes, which made Claude grin for a moment. But the lady at that time was already preparing to hear another shot, and like the heroine and the expected one, the guy with black hair and an attractive old woman's appearance took a gun in his hands and fired, from which he himself did not even move. But everyone around could be frightened by loud, sudden. The sound of the gunshot from the boy's gun caused even birds to fly out of the forest, and the sound itself spread through the forest with an echo. But the girl was attracted by another aroma that could be heard among the sharp smell. She opened her eyes wider and realized that she could smell the beautiful, gentle, relaxing scent of lavender, because there seemed to be a whole field of such flowers not far from them. And then, looking at Claude, who was completely confident in his actions and therefore stood and looked at the results of his shooting, the little lion realized that that palace was not just beautiful, but dangerous. After some time, when Claude was already in the palace and stood in front of the window, looking at some of it, he asked the interlocutor in the room whether he was surprised at all by the. But Kieran himself seemed not to hear the alarm and seriousness in his friend's words, because he looked at the gun in his hands with interest and a smile, asking Claude in response why this should surprise him. However, Claude was still serious, looking out the window and not even turning to the guy. He answered Kieran that the very appearance. In response, the smiling blonde with a gun answered his interlocutor, saying that deception requires payment, and his brother, named Leus, is not just a child who suddenly appeared in their house. And in response, Kieran leaned on his arm and began to smile at Claude, telling him that his younger brother had already sacrificed a lot to be here. So he didn't care that fate had decided to change the course of history. Then the golden-haired boy bowed his head down and kept smiling, telling his protege that in any case he was glad that he had a younger brother and that he had no reason to worry about anything yet. As it turned out, all this time Claude was looking out the window at some guy standing in front of the girl Camelia, and they were clearly doing something. And Claude himself put his hand on the glass and thought that. However, when Claude looked at the child closer, saw how Leus's golden hair shimmered in the sun, how his green eyes sparkled, and how he smiled at everyone, he realized that in fact there was nothing. Even when the main character raised her head up and noticed that the brunette was closely watching her from the window, Claude stopped watching her, thinking about the fact that the Bale family had managed. But when he also looked at how sweetly the supposedly boy was looking at the adult man with fascination and telling him something, Claude smiled, as if he had thought of something or guessed something. When Claude smiled and seemed to be clearly thinking about something, looking at his younger brother Kieran, who is actually a girl, the blonde himself also noticed his strange behavior, and therefore did not take his eyes off his friend. He himself looked at Claude in bewilderment, trying to understand whether his friend had guessed the most important thing, because in fact. And after some time, Galania the heroine was already at a family feast with her older brother, where each family member silently ate their dishes. Being in a luxurious banquet hall with beautiful ornaments, the protagonist didn't even look at the others, but only at her plate. slowly cutting a large, well-done steak into pieces. But at this time, Kieran was looking at her, clearly interested in the new member of the family. He watched as the girl ate slowly and deliberately, as if she didn't want to eat at all, to which Kieran responded with a smile, telling her younger brother to eat more because he was just when the girl seemed to relax and smiled back at the boy and said she would do so, her whole mood disappeared when Mistress Stacy suddenly spoke up, sipping her wine and asking the now wary lady if her lessons were going well. Camellia only told the lady that the lesson was always interesting, but even this she managed to say with embarrassment and uncertainty, to which the lady smiled. The girl continued to eat and listen to the adult woman with her head down, when Stacy told her that if she also tries to study, she will become the same as Kieran. And then the little girl, Kieran himself also intervened in the conversation, telling his mother with a smile that a week had already passed since his younger brother appeared in the house, but he was already trying to study and was even making progress. But this did not make Stacy smile. She smiled, telling the children that effort is something that can be easily said but hard to do, and also hinted that she was not. In response, Kieran also smiled, not to put pressure on her younger brother, because he had barely slept in the last 4 days. And because of Lord Claude, who had shot from a gun, the boy had become timid and seemed to be suffering from insomnia. And even when Mrs. Stacy stood up, telling the children that she would leave the table because she was tired, she walked past the protagonist with a high chin, while the girl did not dare even look at her. And Stacy said menacingly that the girl felt helpless and lost, in a place where everyone expected something from her and, it seemed, did not truly appreciate her, although there was an illusion that everything was fine. And because of such thoughts, but when she looked at her older brother, she smiled sweetly at him, as if everything was fine and she really didn't want to bother him with her problems. Because she knew that Kieran was Then the boy with golden hair in front of her decided to smile back and fold his arms, began a story about his friend Claude, saying that they met him at the academy, and because of the mention of the brunette, the girl plunged into thoughts and reflections about such a strange guy. She remembered the features of his face when Kieran told her that he was the heir of the House of Ihar, and that he was the son of a powerful Duke of the North. Although the girl did not say anything to her older brother, but only looked at her plate with green eyes, she thought of Claude as a person who could be admired. But at the same time, he was incredibly scary and mysterious because of his strictness and confidence. But when Kieran said that next time the heroine should go hunting with him and Claude, because he thought the girl would be a better shot than him, the lady was surprised and waved her palms, telling him that she had never held a gun in her hand. To this, Kieran responded with a smile, saying that everyone has a moment when they experience something for the first time. But when the girl was thinking about how cute her brother was, hearing this, Kieran instantly jumped up from his chair and hurried out of the room, happily asking the servants if his father had arrived. Everything turned out as the main character thought, because half an hour later, when the sky was already showing a red sunset, all the maids who met the milord and worshipped him gathered on the street, and the aristocrat himself at that time stood near the carriage and hugged his wife. Also running out of their house was Kieran, waving to his dad and shouting to him with a smile. And behind him ran Camellia, looking in. Then the milord himself noticed the appearance of his eldest son, which made him smile even more warmly, still hugging his wife, who was also smiling. And Kieran was already approaching his dad, telling him the most pleasant words, confessing his love and telling him how he had missed him all this time. And at this time, Galana the heroine, very similar to her older brother, looked at his dad with curiosity and shock. She was struck only by the thought that now for the first time she saw before her father, who turned out to be a nice person, both outwardly and inwardly, because he smiled at his eldest son and patted him on the head while the child expressed his joy to him. But when her father suddenly looked at the main character, the girl realized that she was not ready to meet him even at that moment. Then goosebumps ran through her body, and she lowered. Meanwhile, the protagonist's father wanted to quickly get to know the new child in the family, so he knelt down in front of her, looking into Camellia's eyes and addressing him as a son. Already about to say something, she decided to look at her own father with curiosity when he said her new name, a man's name in a kind voice, and the child's cuteness so amazed the milord that he continued to look at the girl. The girl did not expect at all that the kind aristocrat would not be like Mrs. Stacy, because the first thing the blonde man in front of her did was raise his hands with a smile and tell the baby to go to her to hug the child as tightly. And at first, the girl's legs were shaking and she did not dare to approach her father from the first seconds. But then he himself hugged her so carefully. While the father smiled and was only glad to see his child at home, among the family, the main character could not believe that she felt hugs from him at all. That's why there was shock on her face, which she herself could not express in words, and the girl burst into tears at the moment when her father told her that he was glad to see her in her home. And because of these words, drops of tears flowed from the girl's green eyes, which rolled down the meeting of the main character and the rest of the family was very warm, and it seemed that everyone was happy to be reunited and rejoiced at the arrival of the Pope. But when the milord was left alone and this made Stacy just smile as if she wanted to hide something. But in the end, she only proved that she had something to hide. And after that, but such an answer did not seem to satisfy my Lord Gillard, who leaned on his arm and looked angry. Out of shame and shock, the milord covered his face with his hand and asked his wife how she thought the girl would play the role of the boy. To which he replied that it was not forever anyway. And my lord was displeased even when the woman in front of him calmly told him that he should think of this girl not as a full-fledged member of the family, but as a temporary change of status. He folded his arms and turned away from his wife, telling Stacy that forcing a little girl to play the role of a boy was a cruel idea. She decided to bang her cup on the saucer and tell my lord that if he spoke of cruelty, he should remember that he himself was heartless and ruthless, and all because of his action in the past that broke. My lord shouted at the girl to stop touching on this topic, but Stacy, angry at him, looked at him with a smile and said that he was the same person who decided to. The fact is that the aristocrat actually slept with the maid of the house, who eventually turned into his mistress, who lay in his bed when the lord lay and got up from bed. But in those periods of then the maid herself, the mother of Galva Gurney, felt sad, who, because of her own feelings and love, seemed to have fallen into a trap from which it would now be incredibly difficult. And Stacy realized that this was not just a game the moment she once failed to see the maid's big belly, or rather, her pregnancy, which she was incredible. What offended Stacy even more was that the pregnant maid was constantly surrounded by caring and anxious servants who brought the maid everything and fulfilled all. But, as it turned out, these were just honey compared to what the lady had to endure. Because one winter day, when she continued to love her only son, she walked in shock through the forest. Stacy was horrified by the fact that after her son went missing, she was able to find him unconscious, naked, lying right in the snow, and the boy's pale body. The lady promised that she would never forgive anyone for such an act towards her son, and therefore, when the pregnant mistress of the milord, who was suspected of evil, was already on her knees, the head of the family himself ordered her to get away. In the end, the woman really did leave the mansion, although she screamed to everyone, cried that it was not she who had committed the terrible act, because Stacy watched her leave from the window and still felt angry at her, which was written on her face, and in her soul there were all sorts of feelings. That's why now Stacy looked at her cup of tea with anger and a smile on her face, telling the mud that her son was still suffering, and that's why she no longer had stupid mercy for everyone in her heart, but believed that people should be treated more strictly. The whole situation left the gentleman clutching his head and looking down, asking his wife what had happened to the mother of the unfortunate girl, and when the mistress's wife answered, in my opinion, "This woman is completely dead or has gone crazy," the blonde took the lady by the hand and looked at her, wanting Stacy to look at him in return. Gillard looked at Stacy with complete confidence and said that even though their eldest son Kieran had poor health, weaker than others, no one had the right to look down on their house, and as if Kieran was the weak point in their family. Stacy's husband meant that he would not leave this situation, but would try to resolve it as soon as possible, and also hinted she only hunched over even more, covering her face with her hand in sadness and confessing to Gillard that she still saw that woman in her nightmares, and that she would never be able to forget what had happened to her son. The devastated, grief-stricken Gillard also spoke about this, looking at the woman with sternness and saying that he, too, would never forgive that woman for what she had done to their son, and therefore would protect Kieran from everything. From the moment the couple had spoken, an evening passed, and then a night. And the next day, when Stacy, as if nothing had happened, spent time in the gazebo, the little children of her friends were run. However, when one of the girls, who had long, chestnut hair and cute eyes, seemed to notice something in the gazebo window, which even made her. The thing is that the girl noticed the snow, which was already falling on the ground in white flakes, and thus caused the little girl admiration and joy. But the adults who were sitting, they just watched as the children played sweetly, and they also noticed that the girl with brown hair called her black-haired friend named Marilyn, begging her to come outside and see the snow garden. Marilyn responded to her friend's idea with doubt and therefore smiled, looking away from her and telling her that she thought it was a bad idea because it was cold there. But she also thought about the fact that, however, when Marilyn the princess said that she had heard that handsome Claude would soon be coming here, the red-haired girl immediately became happy and surprised. The princess even put her hands on her hips and told her friend with a smile that her brother had bragged to her that today he and Claude wanted to go hunting together, and that's why she was now asking Marilyn if she would definitely stay here. In response, the red-haired little girl, out of desperation, replied that she should behave like a lady and not run after anyone. But then the princess with brown hair folded her arms and turned away from her, saying that she wanted too much from herself and was too worried. As it turned out, the girl looked out the window at the right moment because she was able to notice not only her brother, but also Kieran, who was walking along the snowy path and was already talking to the serious and silent Claude, who the girls liked so much. The princess immediately leaned against the glass and began to look at all the guys with admiration, and especially Claude, because he looked incredibly handsome and also had an attractive character. And then Marilyn and both girls were already looking at Claude's appearance from the gazebo window. A calm guy with blue eyes and black hair, who seemed to be but when the girlfriends noticed that Claude herself was not looking at them, but somewhere ahead, they also decided to look in the same direction. And what was their surprise when in the snow, and everyone was incredibly surprised by the fact that the white-haired boy, who was actually a sweet girl, was eating snow while it fell on his tongue in snowflakes. And this amazed every child, including Claude, who was not used to seeing simple joy in children's games in aristocratic circles. This was also noticed by the dissatisfied Stacy, who noticed the fake sun in the window and with a stern expression on her face. However, after the order, other aristocrats sitting at the table began to admire the children, asked Stacy if the boy was her son, to which the princess with chestnut hair also joined the conversation, looked at Stacy with a smile and asked the aristocrat how old her son was, to which the lady politely answered the girl that Stacy with purple hair smiled at the child with a cup in his hand, explaining that her youngest son was 3 years younger than his eldest. But no one suspected that behind the sweet smile there was a woman with terrible and big plans. At that moment, everyone was looking only at how Claude, Kieran, and the guys from Durig approached the main character, interested in what the little girl was doing, which made her feel embarrassed and not even look at. But when she did look at the protagonist's face as well as her older brothers, she realized that they were similar and even this. But the whole charming atmosphere was interrupted the moment the princess with brown hair looked at the main character with suspicion and seriousness, asking the children and adults if Camillus was really a boy. At that very moment, as soon as Stacy heard these words, she began to shake all over, and even the cup she was holding in her hand began to shake. To ease the tension, Stacy decided to tell the princess that her hair was too weird, to which the girl responded with a smile and the words that she simply thought Camillus was pretty, and that anyone would think he was a girl and envy him. Stacy also smiled, telling the girl that as she herself knows, her youngest son has heard this many times, so she is no longer surprised by the words about his appearance, which is very young, unusual, and like an angel. But immediately after this, the princess turned away from her mistress, because she decided to take a closer look at the handsome Camillus, whom, it seems, she already had time to envy because of the beauty that he received, and which leaves no one alone. She also looked at the appearance of the main character's older brother, who seemed to be constantly smiling and was smiling this time, talking to his younger brother and putting his hand on his head. And even when the girl looked at him, blushed, and her eyes sparkled with different glare, he still couldn't tear his gaze away from the handsome, golden-haired guy, who was also in the window. The princess watched the warm moment of Camillus running after everyone, when Claude Kieran held him in his arms and seemed to be about to start hunting with a gun. But the girl also thought that the fair-haired Kieran. Marilyn was also looking at the winter picture, moving closer to the glass, and said with displeasure that if she hadn't known that Camillus was a boy, she would have definitely envied his beauty, because of which everyone keeps an eye on him, and he is constantly deprived of attention, although he speaks little and doesn't. And there was pure truth in Marilyn's words, because the boy was incredibly charming and at the same time more like a girl, which allowed everyone to guess the truth, that Camillus was the baby. And while the girls were thinking about boys and beauty, the Galvergary herself, together with her older brother and Claude, had already come to the place where there are targets for shooting from a gun, which is so loved by the children of aristocrats. Claude was already holding his favorite gun in his hands, examining it and checking it until the protagonist was finally sure that she would be able to compete with them because she had classes today, which the girl had told Kieran about. But Kieran insisted on his own and therefore, with a smile, dragged the supposedly younger brother along with him, telling him that he was mistaken, because Teacher Theodore would come to them tomorrow. But the girl still blushed and was embarrassed. However, the girl stopped and was surprised at that moment when she noticed the silent Claude in front of her, who was once again examining the gun, preparing to start shooting at targets. The calm was short-lived because Kieran suddenly told the girl that today Claude would teach her how to shoot, addressing her as if she were a boy, which made the golden-haired camellia even more frightened. Even when Kieran pushed his younger brother by the shoulders and tried to push him closer to Claude, he said that they needed to be braver, because earlier he had already promised them to be. After a few minutes, Claude was already aiming his gun and looking through the front sight at the targets, talking to Kieran about how he had promised him earlier to teach his younger brother to shoot. And while Claude was taking aim professionally and seemed to be about to shoot, the protagonist appeared quietly and almost unnoticed behind him, looking like a boy, who was afraid to even. And the first to speak was Claude, who usually treated everyone with caution, but now looked at Camellia and asked the child why it had snowed earlier, which seemed to surprise and interest him the most. The golden-haired lady herself was also surprised by this, and looked at him with questioning emotions and surprise, as if not understanding why such a grown-up guy was asking her about such banal, cute, and harmless actions. Then the girl seemed to relax a little, but still didn't want to look at the boy, sadly and quietly telling him that, like a boy, he was interested. The green-eyed lady lifted her head up and looked at the tall guy in front of her, not saying a word, but interested in Claude's words, who eventually laughed at his own words, amazed that suddenly the brunette gave a loaded gun to the golden-haired heroine, which made her very confused and did not understand how to hold the gun correctly, while Claude laughed in front of her and said that it seemed to him that only some wild hedgehogs. The girl was so confused that she looked at the gun as if it were something supernatural. She even looked at the barrel of the weapon with big surprise. However, the real surprise for her was that the tall guy was not just going to throw the gun into her hands, but also help her make her first shot. So he stood behind her and also held the gun with his hands, intending to teach the little girl how to shoot. The first thing Claude did was make the girl with the big gun in her hand raise her wrists and then took her by the elbows, still asking the supposedly younger brother Kieran what. Claude asked Camellia to tell him about the taste of snow and snowflakes, speaking about it with a smile and enthusiasm. The protagonist herself was surprised by what was happening. The protagonist thought seriously about his words and therefore wanted to answer the brunette as soon as possible. But as soon as she decided to express her gratitude, the thing is, there was an incredibly loud shot that once again made the dark birds and sparrows fly out of the forest and treetops, because the main character herself did not notice how she fired without warning. But that was not all, because Claude, who had been holding the iron barrel of the gun all this time, and thus helping the protagonist, hearing a loud sound that could not be confused with anything else, everyone around panicked, including the golden-haired Kieran, who looked at his friend in shock. Absolutely all the servants began to shout that Lord Claude was wounded, and that they needed to immediately call doctors, take the victim into the house, and provide assistance. But all the shouts throughout the palace were interrupted by the brunette himself. What interested Claude most was the reaction of Kieran's younger brother, because he had overheard what he thought was the boy sobbing and crying, and that was why he was about to look at him. And the girl in front of him was really crying, looking at Claude with such despair, regret, and guilt that all of this could be read in her green eyes, from which large drops of tears. The little girl's reaction made Claude smile at the child and ask him why he was crying if he was the one who got the burn and was now feeling. The boy was even more surprised by the fact that Kieran's younger brother did not simply bow before him, but knelt down to collect the first snow in the area with his hands and mold it in. He looked at the fair-haired child with surprise and constantly asked what he was doing, but the protagonist did not give him any answers, but simply did what she thought was necessary. However, he suddenly fell silent at that moment when the girl, having molded a small snowball, took it in her hands and applied it to Claude's burn, which caused the snow to instantly melt. The guy's redness. The main character herself was shaking with fear and anxiety at this time, but Arvon continued to put her hand on the snowball so that it would cool the burn on Claude's palm. sometimes wondering what she was doing. And when the hands of the girl and the boy clasped and the snow increasingly turned into water, which dripped down between the fingers of the Lord, Camellia, in whose head there— And Claude was so surprised by the words of the main character that he looked at her with big eyes without a drop of embarrassment, not believing that a shy child was ready to take responsibility, even for those actions that, it seemed, were not entire. While the protagonist's conscience did not allow her not to apologize to Claude, and the couple themselves looked at each other in surprise, others had already run to them. As it turned out, Marilyn also wanted to get a lot of attention from Claude, and therefore decided to approach him out of concern. But his red-haired girl played so well that she deliberately pushed the heroine aside, and the brunette did not feel any emotions towards Marilyn and the princess, and therefore stood and was silent, while the girls around him were worried and in a trembling voice reassured the guy, saying that the doctor would— Also, everyone was surprised by the fact that the princess of the empire herself, a girl named Rosina, came running to them, to whom Kieran immediately paid attention. Surprised by the appearance of such nobility, Claude himself looked at the princess, and unlike his friend, he was not surprised by the girl's appearance, but rather irritated and angry, because a simple situation in his opinion had acquired the necessary greater publicity, which the brunette did not like. And the girl politely remained silent, coughing in front of everyone, as if hinting that being among others was not just like that. And a moment later, Kieran bowed before her, because the princess is one of the most important guests. The princess then looked at how the brunette with blue eyes was telling the red-haired Merlin that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry because there was only a burn on his hand, also holding the handkerchief that Rosina's friend— But as soon as Marilyn heard that some boy had given handsome Claude a burn across his entire palm, she looked at the protagonist with extreme indignation. Having called the main character a real blockhead, Marilyn, whose red eyes even lit up, was about to approach the supposedly younger brother of Kieran and express all her dissatisfaction to him. And the girl, next to whom there was only her own shadow and no one else, cried, listening to the angry words from another little girl about how he needed to hold— But the anger and shouting were quickly stopped by the main character's brother, who immediately appeared near everyone and sternly asked everyone who had the right to raise their voice to his younger brother. Noticing the appearance of the aristocrat at home, the red-haired girl became even more indignant, telling the adult aristocrat— But my Lord Kieran remained incredibly stern and persistent, asking the little girl if she had raised her voice to his child. Then Marilyn felt awkward, ashamed of herself, and turned away from everyone, quietly saying that she had truly allowed herself to do a lot because of strong— The older brother quickly put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder, ordering Marilyn to apologize to him and his younger brother right now, while the protagonist couldn't look at everyone at this time due to shame and awkwardness. But the girl was more surprised, because her older brother suddenly looked at her with kind eyes and asked the little girl why she didn't apologize to Claude properly now. And a moment later, the protagonist appeared in front of the calm and silent Claude again, apologizing to him both in words and with a bow. And for Kieran, it was a real joy. That's why the blonde smiled, looking at his younger sister, who still pretends to be a boy well and shows everyone her respect and good manners, thanks to which— But for the girl, everything turned upside down at the moment when she clearly heard Marilyn's dissatisfied voice next to her, who at that time folded her arms and looked at the heroine with disapproval. And the surprised lady looked at what fell right in front of her. The thing is that the very same scarf that Marilyn had previously given to Claude fell into the snow. But now the aristocrat, for some reason, decided to get rid of the scarf, which is why everyone around fell silent. The surprised and bewildered lady looked at the guy with questions and incomprehension, as if expecting answers from Claude. But at that time, he was thinking about something completely different, not about the fact that he didn't like the thing. The brunette looked at the girl and told her to do what she had done before, and he also extended his hand to the girl, hinting at the very snowball that Kieran's younger brother allegedly made to instantly cool his hand from a burn. But the golden-haired lady still didn't understand what the guy meant, so she asked him what he meant, and the surprised brunette in response asked the little girl if she was deaf. Then Claude directly asked the protagonist to make another snowball for his burn, asking for it with a smile and as if the Lord no longer cared about the anxiety around him, and even the burn itself was not as important as the request to make a new snowball, because it helped him better than this handkerchief. But not everything turned out so well, because already at home, the girl was subjected to brutal beatings by an adult, and from the force of the blow, she even fell to the floor, and her cheek was very red, which indicated that the adult hit her in the face. And all because of the She touched her burning cheek in fear and looked at the one who was hurting her, realizing that she could not resist the adult because of weakness, despair, and sadness. So the lady again had only to cry. As it turned out, the girl who was beating was Stacy, who was furious when she learned that the youngest child in the family dared to harm Lord Claude. The woman was so angry at the girl that she walked up to her and grabbed her by the shoulders, furiously asking her supposed son if he had forgotten who he was and what he was doing, and if he wanted to take Kieran's place. And while Stacy was humiliating the child and telling him that he shouldn't be near aristocrats, and especially Claude, because they wouldn't help him or feel. And the first one who managed to listen to the lady's terrible curses on Camellia was Lord Claude himself, who quietly walked along the empty, dark corridor, and the golden-haired lady was already crying and just looking at the floor, kneeling as the still furious lady in front of her screamed that she was lucky that Lord Claude was merciful, because otherwise everything could have. It seemed that she enjoyed mocking the child who, it turns out, was finally ruining her life. Which is what Stacy. At that moment, the girl felt completely empty and alone. Lonely in an empty world where she was sitting on the floor and listening to the words of a cruel aristocrat. Wanting to draw a conclusion for the girl, the lady in the blue dress sternly said that the only task of a child is to stay alive and remain quiet, not to get involved in anything inappropriate. And Claude pressed himself against the wall near the half-open door, listening to the lady's words to the Guarini, saying that it would be better for her not to create problems for Kieran. After listening to everything that had happened, he thoughtfully, with his eyes downcast, and merely said out loud that it had been a great performance, although in fact it was the true problems in the aristocratic family. After that, he calmly walked down the dark corridor, intending to hide in his room with a new idea about how the cute-looking boy with golden hair and green eyes turned out to be a victim of someone's anger. But for the protagonist, it was not all, because having experienced Stacy's terrible punishment and the main character herself sat down right under the cold statue and hugged her knees, mourning everything that had happened to her and realizing that today she had cried all day long. The girl hugged her knees and kept crying, realizing that she was very sad for her mother, and that she had never managed to find out where she was and what had happened to her, which made her even sadder, because the girl had no one left, even though she had met her father, whom she saw once a day. But while the little girl thought that everything was lost and her life had finally collapsed, turning into daily attempts to fulfill the requests of others, she did not notice how someone seemed to appear in front of her, because a long human shadow was visible. And the heroine began to raise her head, when with genuine surprise she noticed Mr. Claude in front of her, who was looking at her in silence, while the amazed girl asked the girl was even more surprised by the fact that the guy in front of her, without further ado, knelt down in front of her and leaned down, as if he wanted to do something. Because of which, after that, Camellia watched with interest as the guy in front of her began to collect snow and make a ball out of it with his hands, as if he wanted to respond to the girl with the same thing that she had done to him earlier, making her be. And after the guy made a ball out of the cold snow, he put it on the cheek of the golden-haired girl, which surprised her. Looking at the guy with unveiled blushed, asking the cool, serious brunette what he was doing, while Claude himself did not stop looking at the girl as if he already knew that she was doing everything. Then, when the protagonist fell silent, accepting the courtship, the brunette with curious eyes looked at the girl's reaction and only said that only now he understood what it was, and only after the snow had completely melted, turning into water that flowed down from the little girl's face. Snow continued to fall to the ground in large flakes, while Claude silently wiped the water from his hands, sighed, and was not yet going to leave the baby. Having spent a little time with the little girl, as if in silence wishing the protagonist to survive all the difficulties of the move, and thereby supporting the girl, helping her not to cry anymore. At this moment, not only flakes but also bright moonlight fell on the beautiful angel statue, making the atmosphere more mysterious and beautiful, causing the previously crying lady. And so the girl sat under the statue and touched her cheek with shock on her face, looking at the departing brunette and asking him out loud what it was. But Claude did not want to answer the girl the first time, and at the same time, Stacy wasn't feeling well either, because she was sitting on a chair in a simple dress and listening to her dissatisfied husband tell her that she needed to be more collected and gentle if she wanted to And when Mrs. Stacy still did not respond to her husband's words, the blonde looked at her with severity and displeasure, holding a cigar in his hands and calling Stacy. He even jumped up from his seat with the cigar when his wife asked him in front of him if he meant that her method of punishing Camelius was the result of her intemperance. But to this, then furious, Stacy yelled at her husband and said that she had simply taught the child a lesson, and also reminded him that he had placed the entire upbringing of the child on her shoulders, and that she had the primary right to make decisions and he could not dictate to her. The blonde in front of her looked at Stacy with shock and confusion, while the lady in front of him irritably asked why he didn't understand her, because she wanted all this for the sake of the Bale family, so that they would continue to be a large and After this, the wife turned away from her husband and said with displeasure that if the child had not made a mistake himself, she would not have even punished him, and that is why she does not think that she made a mistake. She sat down on a chair in front of the mirror and confessed to Gillard that she would have done the same to Kieran if he had insulted the name of their family. But in response, then her hand began to reach for the mirror to pick it up when she said that weakness only takes root in a family, especially when mistakes are ignored. So she did what she thought was right. This caused the aristocrat to rise from his chair and slowly approach the woman, angrily telling her that he himself had never thought that a childish mistake could weaken the Bale family, because Gillard still believed that Stacy was exaggerating and calling one thing by other words. But when the gentleman asked Stacy if she thought that it was not a defenseless girl who was disgracing their family, but rather someone else, meaning her, the woman fell silent in shock because a chill ran through her body. After this, the aristocrat could not stand it any longer and was no longer in the room with his wife, and therefore walked along the corridor when a servant followed him, to whom the man asked how things were going with the search for Camelius's mother, that is, the main Kieran. The butler also looked at the gentleman and told him that people were saying that the protagonist's mother had gone looking for her missing child, or that she had her own The aristocrat changed the subject and told the butler that diamond mines had recently been found on neutral territory, but the the butler also imagined the mysterious Claude, because Gillard said that if it were not for the emperor, these treasures would have already been received by milord. The butler stood behind the master and with a serious face admitted that this could lead to war, which made the second sigh and add that some movement had already begun around the country of Gaiora, which was the king of the same state, a wise man with a blue cloak and the name Levin, could receive help from Gillard, as the aristocrat himself said, saying that he also wanted to include an aristocrat named Cass in the matter, so that the men approached the window and began to talk about politics in more depth. Or rather, the butler asked the Duke if he knew about the threat that was increasing due to the whole situation, but suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a worried servant who ran towards them with all his might and seemed to want to warn them about something. He only had to run closer and blurt out through his breath that something bad had happened to Kieran, or rather that he was feeling bad. Kieran was really incredibly ill because he was lying in bed and covered with a blanket because he was having difficulty breathing and was all red, also sweating constantly. In the room with the sick child of the family, there was already a mother, Stacy, who fell on the bed and clutched her son's bed with her hands, not wanting to survive his loss and worrying about his health. Also in the bedroom was the head of the family, who was one of the first to rush to his son and immediately order the servants to tell him everything about his son's condition. And behind him was also visible the first to respond to the aristocrat's decree was the doctor himself, who looked at everyone with regret and sadness, which did not mean anything good, because Stacy responded to him mentally, irritated even by the bitter truth about her son's condition. An even greater defeat for the parents was that the doctor admitted not only that there was no more medicine for Kieran, but also that his life was slowly ending. And at this time, the patient seemed not to hear. A chill ran through the aristocrat's body again, and he grabbed his head in fear, asking the doctor if there was at least some medicine that could be made and given to Kieran. But all conversations were interrupted by Claude, who suddenly appeared in the doorframe with folded hands and told everyone to quickly send the sick. After that, he began to slowly enter the room and explain his words to everyone, saying that he had heard about a man named Schmidt. A crying Stacy was also looking at him, who was sitting in Claude's hope, while Claude used the moment and calmly told everyone that Mal Gaor was on the border with a man named Casa, and he could. Hearing this, the golden-haired aristocrat felt as if his head was splitting and he began to touch it, trying to express his concerns about the Dr. Schmidt. But in order to convince everyone present, the brunette approached his father and told him to his face that everything could work out, because this same Dr. Schmidt was guilty of his father. Or rather, he should have done a favor a long time ago, and Claude also looked at his old friend who was still sleeping and sighing from fatigue, telling everyone that it would be a great tragedy to lose such a talented person like Kieran. Hearing this, Stacy was the first to break down and not just start screaming, but jumped up from her seat and almost attacked them, falling to the floor, which scared the golden-haired aristocrat. And when Gillard was already hugging his wife tightly and not letting her pounce on the calm Claude, Stacy screamed at NGO with madness and despair. Claude just turned away from them, telling Gillard that he would give him some time to think about it, until Stacy stopped screaming at him, begging him to help her son. The golden-haired aristocrat, worried about the whole situation, could only silently watch as Claude turned away from them. But as soon as Claude, with a calm and balanced face, left the bedroom in which the sick Kieran lay, he noticed someone else out of the corner of his eye next to him. The thing is that there was a small and quiet girl standing near the wall, looking like a boy, who had her head down and didn't even look at Claude. But he was still able. Camellia, clearly sad, as always not smiling, was alone and stood near the seat in the hallway, because she was probably forbidden to approach her brother, because in fact, she is not considered a member of the family. And when Claude walked past her silently, with his hands in his pockets and seemingly not wanting to greet her, the girl, showing him respect, bowed low, even when the aristocrat simply continued walking. But suddenly not everything turned out to be so calm for the main character, because suddenly the guy with blue eyes, having walked a couple of steps, stopped, responding to the protagonist as if he wanted to ask her something. Only after this did Claude turn around and calmly ask the supposedly young man in front of him how old he was, causing the girl to look at him in surprise. Even she wondered for a moment why the aristocrat was interested in her return, but she bowed to him anyway and replied, now he is 12 years. Even after this, the tall and calm, mysterious Claude did not leave, but turned to the little girl, asking the child about the academy, to which the protagonist again answered, saying that she does not study anywhere, but Professor Theodore teaches her here, at home. This even made Claude turn to the girl and look at her with more interest, as if he was thinking about something, without saying a word. Only after a minute of looking at the baby's appearance, the guy suddenly turned his back to her again and calmly replied that in that case they would only meet in a few years. Leaving the girl without explanations and answers, Claude was already leaving, while the lady stared at him with shock and curiosity, trying to find the details on her own, shocked and not understand. As it turned out, Claude did not deceive the lady, but told the pure truth, because after this incident they never saw each other again. The little girl realized that it would be for a long time, because every day, and during this time, the girl had already managed not only to adapt to the role of a boy and finally get used to it, but also to become even more beautiful. But at that moment, a stunned and worried maid was already running towards her, shouting to the supposed boy that it was very risky and he could get sick. But the forecaster didn't care. Suddenly, the main character, who had grown up 4 years earlier, emerged from the water, enjoying the water with her whole body and breathing in the clean air, while a panicking maid was next to her, afraid that the boy would catch a cold. Now the smiling girl, who even seemed happy, was already 16 years old and had become more mature and beautiful, which is why now, smiling at Betty, he asked her how she could. After a while, the girl nevertheless came out of the water and, thanking the maid who brought her a towel, threw the cloth over herself, looking at the gardens and listening to her words about how everything was now zoological. And also, as Betty said, behind the Pratonoit Potosiano ran the maid Betty, who was extremely outraged by the girl's actions, did not raise her voice at her. Only words were not important to Camellia, and so the protagonist looked away indifferently, agreeing with Betty as if she was tired, and everything turned out to be as the main character said. Because right now, 2 cute maids with green and red hair were looking at her, clearly admiring the beauty of the hair. Then Betty decided to hint to the girl with a smile on her face that perhaps they were looking at her because of the girl's cuteness and charm, and she thought, looked down, when Betty began to tell her about Mrs. Stacy, who would soon return to them, and if he saw her like this, wet and unkempt. The thing is, she still remembered the silhouette of her beloved brother, recalling with sadness that 4 winters had already passed since Kieran had gone north in search of a cure, which is why she had never seen him since that. But it wasn't all that bad. Because the king of the country of Gaior, who sits on the throne and has fancy clothes with fur, the girl imagined Stacy and Kieran standing in front of the academy of another kingdom, because she remembered how her father was against his son leaving to study and could not come to terms with it. And now, when the protagonist sadly lowered her head and was about to cry, realizing that in all 4 years she had not received even a letter from Kieran or Claude, when the girl stood there devastated and thought about how she wanted her brother to get well soon so that everyone could return to the family. Otherwise, she would definitely never be able to. She instantly turned to the servant in surprise because she believed that fate had heard her prayers. Because just now she was thinking about the academy, and now people from it were. The girl immediately went to tidy herself up after bathing in the water, while the entire snow-white palace with a red roof was flaunting itself in the bright sun and around nature, bushes, and Litva. And in one of the rooms, as it turned out, the guests were not Kieran and Claude, but some 3 men in suits who were sitting on a red sofa and in the office telling something to the sad head of the family, Gillard, that they could not put off something on a permanent basis. While the blonde looked at the table with a serious attitude and dried up the words of the guests from the academy, they themselves said that the king could no longer tolerate them while they delayed Camilius's entry into the academy, which turned out to be the bearded man, who was gray-haired and had glasses, was telling the aristocrat that the situation was already difficult, also gesturing with his hand, the situation. But then the guy in front of him with golden hair and green eyes leaned forward in sadness, asking his interlocutor if they had received his letter about his wife being engaged in the education of his children, and he was also sure that we were telling them about the need to postpone this issue for a long time. To this, the gray-haired old man with glasses in front of him replied that he always respected him. But the Ihar house, in which Claude was also present, would very much like to see Camilius. And when the worried dad started asking those present why Claude needed his son, the main character suddenly entered the room in the guise of a boy. Opened the door. All the guests quickly looked at the amazingly beautiful boy, who was actually a girl, who looked at them with surprise and curiosity at what was happening and amazed everyone with his charm. And while Galana Gurnia calmly walked to her father, all the guests in the office were surprised by the boy and did. Meanwhile, the protagonist silently sat down next to her dad on the red sofa, a little embarrassed by the presence of. And a minute later, the old man himself spoke, coughing into his hand and telling Milord Gillard that he sincerely. Then the girl sadly lowered her gaze as if thinking about something or remembering something that made her sad again, worrying about others more than about herself. The thing is, the lady's head was still flashing with moments from that very evening when she sat under the statue on a snowy day and looked at the face of the curious Claude, who confessed. And the first to break the silence was the blonde, who was still thinking hard about what had happened, telling everyone that if Camilius were to go to the academy, he would have. The insistent guest in the Bale's house began to diligently tell the aristocrats that they themselves could give the boy a room. But listening to it was actually a violation of the academy's rules, so he did not know what to do. It was worth Mr. Gillard to say angrily that the teacher Theodore, with whom Camilius was studying, told him that Camilius had surpassed. The guest even said that if her father was worried about the distance separating them, he himself could provide housing in the capital, which made the golden-haired lady surprised because the situation was starting to get worse. And she also understood that she had to intervene. Having heard even one word about the capital, the girl unconsciously clenched her fists and began to worry. Then, having gathered up her courage and desire, the girl, who looks exactly like her father, looked at him and admitted that she wanted to go herself, which surprised her father to the depths of his soul. She looked at him with eyes full of determination, saying that she could protect the name of Kieran and glorify the Bale family with her achievements, because she thought that her mother would not be against it and that she would succeed. For a second, there was silence in the office with its beautiful red sofas and aristocrats. Everyone was waiting for each other's reaction, not expecting that the boy himself would want to go to the academy and be separated from his. The girl's father sighed and asked his supposed son if he really wanted this, to which the girl responded with enthusiasm, saying that she had always dreamed about this and was ready to prove. Then the father touched his daughter's hand and said that in that case he could not contradict his son, if he himself wanted to quickly correct the situation and calm everyone. It was clear from the heroine's father's face that he was very tired and exhausted, all because of stress. But looking at the girl liked her father's words, which is why she looked at him with admiration and inspiration, saying that she agreed with everything, talking about herself as a boy, so that no one would have any suspicions that the baby was of the opposite sex. Meanwhile, the gray-haired guest sitting on the sofa seemed to be happy with the final decision too, because he scratched his beard and told everyone with a smile that parents usually can't refuse their children, and so they will all leave to wait for Camilius after the tear. After this, All the men present in dark coats hurried to get dressed and put their hats on their heads, while a gray-haired old man next to them told the aristocrat that he was leaving here. And before leaving, he would also visit the gardens. And Gillard didn't respond to the guests in any way, as if he wanted them to quickly leave the office and leave him alone with the child, which is why he tapped the sofa with his hand, while the protagonist looked down in embarrassment. But suddenly, before leaving, the last of the men looked at the main character as if he was already making insidious plans for the little girl, because with an evil smile, he turned to her and asked if he— After this event, all the heroines found themselves in a luxurious garden, where there were not only well-groomed bushes, roses, and gazebos with luxurious pshenfai trees, but the thing is that the protagonist was running along the stone path and clearly intended to arrive somewhere, thinking about the fact that her mother was in the capital and it seemed that she would be able to see her if she studied at the academy. But as soon as she remembered her beloved mother, whom she never got to see after 4 long years, the little girl stopped because her legs wobbled, because the wind lifted green leaves into the air, which rushed past the stopped girl with a boyish hairstyle and golden hair, because she decided for a moment to think about how her mother lived all this time, where she is. The girl sadly remembered her mother's brown hair, thinking that now she hardly knows that her daughter is now a member of the Bale family. And the girl also she becomes even more of a lady at the moment when she remembers herself in her youth, when she smiled only because her mother was always there, and she smiled the same way, which made when the lady realized that Toga was completely happy for the reason that she did not have to pretend to be someone and play roles, she clenched her hand into a fist and trembled, deciding to pull herself together and understand. The girl looked forward with determination and sternness, with the intention of taking everything into her own, albeit trembling hands, because Camellia, like no one else. And when the protagonist decided to make radical changes in her life, a man in a dark jacket suddenly appeared behind her, who said the girl's male name, intending to talk to her. As soon as the heroine turned around, she noticed with fear behind her not just a man, but a scary gentleman with a sly smile and eyes. The girl decided to bow to the gentleman first, even though she didn't know his name, and also said that she was glad to see him. But the mysterious man because when he looked at the lady with exactly the same smile, with interest and unhealthy curiosity, touched his chin and said to Camillus that he could call him Eddie. The girl, looking like a boy in front of a strange man, immediately stopped and walked away from him a few steps, wondering why he was looking at her so strangely, which even made the girl feel uneasy. But the stranger, calling himself Eddie and connected with the academy, came closer to the lady and did not stop talking, saying that the most beautiful flowers are always plucked, and the same thing happens to people in real life. The girl began to worry even more at that moment when the man asked her to look at a blue butterfly not far from them, which was sitting on a yellow. After that, Eddie put his hand on the shoulder of the wary Jaren, who was silent when he was telling the story. But he was just telling his thoughts out loud and there was no need to worry. He also hastened to tell the lady with a scary smile on his face that there are those in the world who don't like people like him, meaning the main character, which made the protagonite woman even more worried. That's why Camellia looked at Eddie with real fear in her eyes, and the man, who apparently should only be telling the aristocrats about the academy, was already scaring her and telling the girl to be more careful in her actions. And sometime after the strange event, when the maids also learned about Camelia's departure, the red-haired servant hurried to pounce on the proagonite, shouting that she had heard that my lord, that is, the heroine. The girl immediately pounced on the little girl with hugs and started screaming that the child shouldn't go to the capital. And she also asked to take her with them because she doesn't understand how such a weak boy will be in an unfamiliar place. In response, the main character only smiled at the maid named Peepee and asked her how she could leave for the capital without her, hinting that she was just going to take the girl with her so that she would not worry. And also the lady thought that in all 4 years, the golden-haired lady looked at Pippi kindly and was amazed by her, telling her that she shouldn't worry alone because her dad would never let her go alone. To which the red-haired lady responded. The girl realized that she could not imagine her life without Pippi, who even now followed the main heroine and jumped up and down joyfully, evoked melodies and shouted to everyone with joy that she was going to the capital with Mr. Camelius. While the girl herself. But suddenly the girl's joys stopped at the moment when the protagonist decided to ask Pippi something, which is why the cranberry-haired lady looked at the heroine and asked the supposedly guy what was wrong. Suddenly, the golden-haired lady with green eyes turned towards the maid with a smile and asked if she still wanted to see her in a dress, hinting that the girl had always told the protagonist about this. At that moment, Pippi seemed to have an idea, because she had another great idea. A reason to go with the main character to the capital, because when the girl was surprised, the aristocrat suggested that she choose a dress herself, to her taste. The surprised lady began to ask the girl if she could really choose a dress for such a noble person as she, because of which the sweet lady with golden hair only smiled and said that everything was so. After that, they both went to the palace to prepare for departure, while Pippi jumped and ran, already thinking out loud about what kind of dress she would come up with for the protagonist. And Camelia at this time was thinking about how, as soon as she arrived in the capital, she would go to Louvre to look for her mother. And after a few days, the heroes really found themselves in a city with tall, beautiful buildings, which are decorated with a clear blue sky, and the capital itself is called Ether, which is the center of the empire in which the girl looked with surprise and curiosity at the views from the carriage window, the city where the local townspeople lived, and she also asked her father if this was the capital. The protagonist sadly replied that she had been told many times that it was very unsafe outside her hometown, and that was why she did not dare to go anywhere. And when the girl with short hair, with great sadness in her soul, did not answer her dad right away, but became silent, which also made Gillard sad. Looking at his daughter, he himself decided to continue the conversation with a story that the capital really is unsafe, and the girl was able to. And their expensive carriage slowly passes by a variety of places, while some passers-by looked at them. And Gillard calmed his child with the words that, if you walk in the right company, the city can give you good emotions. Gradually, the aristocrat and his son, who is actually a daughter, arrived at a tall white building, which caused the horses to stop galloping and the transport to stop, because it seems that the curious girl was already getting out of the carriage when her father held the door for her and said that they had arrived, and the little girl looked with surprise on her face at the multi-story beautiful building, as well as the city. Taking a closer look at the building with many windows, the girl thought for a moment that this was her academy. But her father first explained that an imperial tailor worked there, who made clothes to order, and it was him that he asked to sew a student uniform for his son, Camillus. And when the father and daughter were about to enter the building and meet the tailor, they did not notice at first how someone appeared behind them. The main character turned back with curiosity and surprise, and her father did the same, which is why, when he realized who had appeared behind them, he was incredibly. The thing is that behind them stood not a simple passerby, but one of the highest-ranking people in the empire, or rather, the elder brother of Princess Rosina with the brown. Prince Bale smiled sweetly at Camillus first, telling the supposed boy that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and showing him his goodwill, which left the protagonist deeply confused and shocked. The father had already placed his hand on his chest and bowed to the prince, showing him his respect. And the same action was performed by the main character out of anxiety, tensed by the unexpected appearance of an influential, albeit young guy. The girl began to repeat her father's movements and worship the aristocrat, thinking about the fact that she seemed to be more with shocked eyes. The prince also said that his father, the emperor, eagerly desired a meeting with Camillus. And as soon as the heroine began to think about why she was honored to meet the majestic man of the empire, the smiling prince did not lose his confidence and joy, and therefore pressed the girl to himself as a sign of strong friendship, telling the child. And the lady decided to finally calm down, sigh, and tell her father that she would indeed spend time with the prince, with whom she would go together into the building, which the brown-haired aristocrat. After that, the couple was already in the beautiful corridor of the building, where the tailor provided his services, where they both walked along the red carpet past the servants, while the prince did not even pay attention to others, but only spoke to the protagonist, addressing her as a boy and saying that during this time he had grown up, but his face and body were still thin. And the girl involuntarily shuddered when the prince began to talk about her skills, howling that in childhood he was a boy who did not know how to use a gun. But these words never made the girl remember the hunt, because she remembered its most vivid consequences, when her stepmother attacked her and warned her that she should not be in the circle of the prince, and especially Claude, because no one would. The prince continued to talk only about the protagonist with a smile on his face, thinking that the girl was a boy and telling him that everyone had been talking about him since the director had decided to send him to the academy. And that was why he was now asking Camillus if he. Hearing this, the girl was surprised and looked at the prince, asking if people were really talking about her. To which the aristocrat replied that it was true and, according to him, Then the prince told the little girl that everyone was saying that the youngest son of the Bales, who had not appeared in public before, would finally appear in the capital, and therefore the brown-haired guy also admitted that he didn't think that the guy would grow up so natural, which made the girl feel really awkward. She looked away with a smile and replied that she was in. Meanwhile, the couple had already managed to approach the necessary high and snow-white doors, where the tailor was waiting for them, which is why the prince said that they had already arrived and they needed to go in. And when they both entered the tailor's office, the first thing they saw was the tailor himself, who turned to them and immediately said that he had another client now, which is why the bare back of a tall, fit. While the main character followed the prince and was sad, not understanding who the tailor was currently working with, the prince confidently walked towards the master and waved his hand, calling him Frank and as if greeting him, not paying attention to the warning. Noticing that an aristocrat from high society had entered his room, the master with gray hair and beard looked at the prince and apologized to him. Looking at the prince responded to the tailor's words with a smile, saying that he had simply brought his client here, who had gotten lost, and also sat down on the snow-white sofa as comfortably as possible and pointed with his hand at the protagonist. As soon as the prince mentioned a name like Claude, because he was the master's client, the golden-haired girl became agitated, from which her soul seemed to sink into her heels. She looked only at the floor. Also, suddenly, a tall guy came up to her and began to stare at the girl, talking to her as if she were a boy, saying that he hadn't changed at all. And at that moment, the heroine decided to raise her head and look at Claude. Surprised by in front of her, the amazed Camellia really saw the smiling and charismatic Claude, who examined every line of her face and welcomed her to the city. But the lady herself could not believe that she met him and after some time, the tailor also took care of the protagonist, thanks to which the girl began to measure her waist, arms, hips, shoulders, and other body parameters with a sewing ruler. While the girl thought and all this time, while she stood quietly and sometimes didn't even breathe, so that Master Frank could take precise measurements, she looked at the one who didn't take his eyes off her. And without moving, the girl wondered why he was still there and why he was looking at her so strangely. But at that moment, the gray-haired master with a white beard addressed the girl as if he were Camillus, and asked the supposedly boy to take off. In response, the heroine only turned away from the serious man, realizing that her biggest deception could be revealed, and because of this, she asked the tailor if he could simply change the parameters, sighing from the inconvenience. But the tailor, who was a professional in his field, thanks to many years of experience, was able to understand that the child was now wearing. Imagining in his mind the beautiful uniform of the academy students, the tailor told Camillus that he was standing there only for the uniform, which had to. At this time, the main character looked at Claude and the prince, who at that time were elegantly sitting on the sofa and talking about something, while the tailor continued to convince the girl that the clothes should still be suitable. Looking away with worries and doubts, Camellia realized that she could not avoid this situation and decided that in this case she would do everything so that only the tailor would know about her real gender, and therefore asked him if there was a screen here to undress. Hearing the girl's request, the gray-haired man in a dark suit raised his hand and gestured to two maids who were standing nearby and immediately understood what they needed to do, intending. One of them silently carried out the order and straightened the red screen door, thanks to which Camellia could calmly take off her thick and probably hot clothes, which helped her hide all her female forms and make them look male. This immediately interested Claude, who was still looking at the screen as if he was afraid of missing something and not understanding why the boy with golden hair decided to undress separately from everyone else. Meanwhile, the main character, finding herself alone with the tailor, sighed heavily and was already untying the collar, realizing that after 4 long years, another person would learn something that he clearly shouldn't have learned. The first to fall to the floor was the girl's collar, which was pure white in color, and the tailor, who was holding a sewing ruler in his hands, was waiting. At first, the gray-haired and white-bearded man calmly looked at the lady and did not expect anything unusual at all, because he has to notice the peculiarities of his clients' bodies almost every day and sew the perfect clothes for them. However, as soon as the heroine took off her shirt, showing her body, Frank's face showed genuine surprise and shock combined, which seemed to take away his speech, when the thought suddenly flashed through his head that in front of him was a fragile and petite girl, and not a supposedly weak boy, because Camellia was wearing white and high-quality underwear, which hid her. After that, the girl allowed the tailor to approach, which is why he first began to measure the heroine's waist. But even at that moment, he still called Camellia sir. A few minutes later, the tailor had done his job and the girl had put on her white shirt again. but she looked at the tailor with surprise when he advised her to put on what he had in his hands, namely, some white clothes. The lady looked at the tailor with surprise because the gray-haired and bearded man with glasses insisted on his own, most likely because the lady's clothes were too tight and uncomfortable. But when the girl, already holding the shirt in her hands, looked at the tailor with genuine surprise, her eyes wide open, he confessed to her that the more she tries to hide her body from everyone, the more noticeable it becomes. And when Claude and the prince were already tired of waiting for Camillus, constantly thinking about why the boy was staying in the room with the porter for so long, the girl immediately caught Claude's attention. He was examining the girl's attire, and it seemed, thanks to it, the prince, a confident guy, immediately approached the girl and, not suspecting that she was a lady, again put his hand on her shoulder. The brown-haired, smiling gentleman did not lag behind the heroine and constantly chatted about something, offering her to go because everything seemed to turn out as the prince had planned. Because sometime after the tailor had received the measurements and was already making uniforms for the teenagers, they decided. Claude sat calmly and seriously, as if nothing surprised him, and this seemed to be typical of him, because he often rides horses and is well trained in this, which cannot be said about the protagonist. After all, she almost blushed when she sat on a moving horse with Monsieur Claude, and she couldn't even raise her head from embarrassment and wondering why she was. The prince was unhappy that Claude had taken his friend away from him, and he irritably asked him why he had decided to take Camillus into his own hands. Wade took Claude's words as a challenge and an insult at the same time, so he looked at his opponent with a smile, saying that he would regret his words, and that he would also beat him in the— But suddenly, Claude decided to address the main character, leaning towards her ear and whispering that he was asking the boy to at least smile, because he looked as if nothing suited him. And because of this, she blushed even more at that moment when the brunette honestly confessed, addressing the heroine as Camillus and telling her that everyone would think that he— All the way when the protagonist was with Claude on horseback, the girl thought about when she would arrive at her palace. But when the ride ended and she got off the horse, all three stood next to each other, and, it seems, this made the heroine even more awkward. Especially when the prince looked at her with a smile. The boys looked at Camillus with curiosity, but only the prince showed everyone his surprise when the lady, disguised as an aristocrat, admitted that she had arrived here for the first time. The heroine also lowered her green eyes down and confessed to Claude and Wade that they were close friends of Kieran and the lady. The prince asked Camillus if this was really the case, which is why the lady replied that the palace was too luxurious and beautiful for her. But as soon as she said that, and while the girl was trying to understand what it was and what the mysterious and seemingly dissatisfied Claude meant, she looked down. However, as soon as he took a couple of steps towards the heroine, Claude immediately prevented the prince from doing what he wanted, because she looked at Claude with her eyes wide open and asked him directly if he dared to come between the prince and Camillus, hinting that the other had no right to do so. But Claude looked at his interlocutor with blue, stern eyes and was not afraid to make a remark to the prince, while being a milord, because in an angry voice, the prince could only fold his arms in displeasure and look at Claude as if he had quickly turned from a comrade and close friend into an adversary. But this did not frighten Claude, who remained in his place and asked Wade if he himself had forgotten what his character had led to. A quarrel quickly began between the guys, in which the prince asked Claude with displeasure whether he thought it was he who seduced the young sheriff. But when Claude confidently told the prince that the fact that Camillus was an incredibly handsome boy was true, the girl blushed and looked down in embarrassment because they were— And while the main character could not recover from the shock and embarrassment, calm and confident in his words, Claude continued to look at the prince and said that The prince laughed and said that it seemed that Claude got up on the wrong side of the bed today, and that was why he was behaving strangely. But the heroine looked warily at the ground when he told the girl not to take everything to heart, because he was sure that Claude's anger was— At this, the prince, still unhappy with the situation and Claude's behavior, turned away from everyone and asked the brunette if he could be a little more polite. But Claude only looked at him as if he didn't care. Because the blue-eyed guy was looking at the main character, who also decided to say something, but said the first words uncertainly and quietly, which made Claude— The thing is, the golden-haired girl, talking about herself as a guy, said that she doesn't intend to please anyone, as Claude had previously claimed, but is just trying to be a polite aristocrat with everyone, without exception. When the protagonist confessed to the guy that she did not intend to receive profit from anyone, the brunette was surprised and looked at her as if he did not expect such words at all, but only looked at Camellia with big eyes. Claude, who was petrified by shock, was even more surprised by the fact that the child, who had previously been polite and kind to everyone, suddenly expressed dissatisfaction in the form of words. As a result, the astonished Claude, who had suddenly fallen silent, could only watch as the main character hurried up the steps with the red carpet and walked away from them, proving that she did not want to be like the brunette. But after such an unexpected event, he began to laugh involuntarily and do it louder and louder, looking at the protagonist leaving and saying that this is much more interesting than what happened before, and he seems to like it. However, after some time, the company of three aristocrats still found themselves together because they were sitting in a snow-white gazebo surrounded by a luxurious garden, where they were drinking tea at the table and were already chatting about something. There was not only tea on the table because the guests brought a variety of different delicacies and sweets, including chocolate cakes, muffins, pieces of cake, and rolls, and all this so that the future heirs of the duchies and other lands could have a good rest. The main character couldn't take her eyes off them, looking at each dessert with big eyes and blush on her cheeks, realizing that they looked incredibly appetizing and beautiful, and tasted even more aromatic, which made her want to try it. However, the lady quickly became uncomfortable when Claude, sitting next to her and drinking tea, said that it was quite a sight, and therefore told her to eat quickly, but not to look at the desserts as if he were a hungry puppy. In response, the main character turned away from the one who seemed to be no longer pleasant to her, speaking of herself as if she were a boy, and saying that he was not hungry at all and therefore was simply enjoying the view, and did not want to try it. Because of this, the prince began to smile. So he put his elbows on the table and said to Camillus that he was most likely hungry after the horse ride, and therefore he also offers him something to eat, if he wants to try at least one cake or roll. Then the main character realized that she was not just in a gazebo, where she was sitting at the same table with Claude, who also demonstratively put his elbow on the edge of the table, but in a place where everyone was smiling falsely at each other, and in fact, because the prince did the same thing, who didn't show his true emotions to everyone, but only smiled and was polite, offering the heroine something to eat, although in fact, he wanted to get to know his interlocutors better. And then the heroine looked sadly at the table and explained to everyone that in that case, she would only take a small portion of dessert, because she really wasn't hungry, as Claude and the prince thought. The prince told the girl to say her last words after he had eaten, because with his white-gloved hand, he presented the girl with a plate of a charming sandwich, which immediately surprised the golden-haired lady at its appetizing taste. At first, she took it in her hands and looked at it for a while, but as soon as she took a piece from it and tried it, even greater amazement immediately appeared on her face, and she wondered whether she had ever eaten such a delicious sandwich. Claude sat and silently watched as the prince and the heroine interacted sweetly with each other. The blonde girl ate with a smile on her face and enjoyed the taste of her sandwich. But after a while, the prince decided to talk about something else, because with a sly grin, he took a cup of tea in his hands and said that most likely his younger sister was already. The prince immediately turned to Camillus and asked the boy if he had any candidates for marriage, which made the fake guy with golden hair feel awkward, and he smiled, saying that it was too early. At that moment, the prince looked at the protagonist with surprise and asked her, supposedly a boy, if he had already heard about some news, which he himself. And the girl looked at the prince with real shock, opening her mouth and, it seemed, losing the gift of speech when Aide explained that her older brother Kieran was the groom for his younger sister, and they would soon be husband and wife. Soon there was silence at the table, and only the prince spoke, explaining to the astonished Camellia that the lady, disguised as a boy, wanted to answer something but changed her mind, because with devastation and as if darkness. And at this time, Milord Claude suddenly extended another sandwich to the heroine, telling her that Madame Stacy had not yet returned to the north. And when Claude, with his eyes closed, explained to the heroine that it was not surprising that only a few people knew about this news, the protagonist was surprised, wondering whether Claude was supporting her now, or whether it seemed to her. The black-eyed guy sometimes still glanced at the girl and addressed her as a boy, saying that it would be best to eat her one sandwich, otherwise she would die of hunger. Hearing this, the girl looked at him indignantly and thought that she would never have even imagined that a person like him could be so caring. but still she did not understand why he was behaving so strangely. Then the girl looked at him clearly with emotions of fear and apprehension, seriously wondering what was going on in Claude's room and what was the reason for his strange behavior, which not only made her feel awkward, but also a little scared. And suddenly, the child, who was cowardly in his eyes, grabbed a sandwich from the plate and looked at Claude, saying that if his body was so exciting to the gentleman, this only made the charismatic and persistent guy smile, who was looking closely at the girl and was already expecting her to show character. Well, it seems not so. And while the main character was angrily and silently chewing, proving to Claude that she did not intend to tolerate him, but would do what she wanted, suddenly Claude extended. It turns out that the guy was talking about that very moment when they would become closer to each other, which he was incredibly looking forward to, which made the golden-haired lady look at him with silent shock, not believing that all this was reality, and the suspicious Claude became even stranger. But Claude himself, being confident in his actions, smiled slyly, looking straight at the girl and grieving for her, as if this moment would not just be joyful for him, but a real pleasure, which made the girl wonder what the gentleman was trying to convey to her. The main character was so shocked and confused that after a while she decided to go home, which is why she soon stood in front of the prince and Claude and bowed along with the butler, saying that she was deviating from them and asking for forgiveness for this. The prince was glad to say goodbye to the protagonist and therefore waved his hand goodbye with a smile. And at the same time, Claude was silent and the lady thought only about him, realizing that he was trying to act like an aristocrat, but showed strange reactions when she was teased. And Claude himself recalled in his head the reaction of the main character at that very moment when he confessed to her these expectations of even greater rapprochement, when the little girl looked at him with shock. However, as soon as he realized that he was flirting with the boy and that he only liked it, Claude's soul sank into his heels, and he realized that he seemed to be experiencing unusual, closer, and more interesting feelings for the guy, which he could not calm down. The prince noticed his friend's strange behavior, and all this time he was looking at his suddenly quiet interlocutor, who was also nervous and angry, which made Wade wonder what had suddenly happened to him. He looked at Claude with bewilderment and asked why he was so gloomy today, perfectly noticing that Claude was acting strangely around Camillus, but as expected, the brunette would not tell anyone the truth about his feelings. When Claude replied that he was not gloomy at all, the prince looked at him mockingly and said that he was lying because he already felt that he liked Camillus incredibly, and he could not hide it even under a thick layer of lies and anger. But Claude still remained silent and did not want to confess, while the prince took green grapes from the plate and said that he did not see the difference between men and women, because if they were beautiful, each of them would be his. He also charismatically threw a grape into his mouth and looked at Claude with a smile and said that this is the reason why he likes Claude and Camillus. But he also threatened Claude not to approach Camillus and not to pester him, because he seems to be jealous. The thing is that Pins considers Camillus a perfect replacement for Kieran, which is why he imagined how the main character looked in the mirror and her older brother was reflected in it, and the prince intends to use their similarity in noble political affairs. And now, when the golden rays of the sunset fell on Bade, he looked at Claude with confidence and told him that Camillus would be his in any case, and it would be better for him not to get in the way, and especially not to interfere with. In response, Claude was silent, taking a red apple in his hands and examining the fruit, thinking about something of his own, and realizing that the prince was also not indifferent to Camillus, and there was no longer friendship between them. Meanwhile, the prince stood up from his chair and placed his hands on the surface, asking Claude if it was time for them to go because the royal banquet would soon begin. And after some time, the couple of friends were already leaving the gazebo and walking along the road, while the prince with sighs told Claude that he had already refused many aristocratic women in marriage over the past year, because he thought that his father was impatient to marry him to someone. Then the prince turned around and began to laugh in Claude's face, saying that he already knew perfectly well that the Marquis's daughter, a red-haired girl named Marilyn, was Claude's fiancée, and therefore he could not marry her. Wade also tells his colleague that they need to go now, so they need to hurry and go to the palace because it's already dark, but Claude just looked away, thinking about something of his own. Meanwhile, the main character spent time with a certain mustachioed man who examined her body while the protagonistka Molsla and her father was in the room with her, waiting for what the doctor would say after the examination. The doctor looked at Lord Gillard with politeness and a smile and said that his son only had an upset stomach, and he would prescribe him a tonic, also advising the child to rest and not out of worry and fatigue. The golden-haired father, sitting on the sofa, sighed, lowered his head and told Camillus that he was feeling bad now, and therefore the embarrassed girl looked away from her dad and thanked him for his concern, realizing that he was more worried about her condition than anyone else in her life. And so, after some time, when it was already a deep, dark evening outside the window, the main character was alone in her bedroom and was taking off her outerwear, while on the table, it seemed, there were already some candies of different colors. The first thing the main character did was take off her annoying bra, which hid her feminine forms, but at the same time, the girl constantly had to sacrifice comfort, which is why she even sighed from the sudden comfort of being naked when she felt only a white shirt on herself, saying out loud that she felt much better this way. But besides that, the girl also wanted to breathe some fresh air. That is why the lady looked at the high window, which opened up a view of the night sky with a large number of stars, which attracted the girl even more, and she had a desire to enjoy nature alone, without friends. She opened the window doors with her hands, which made a slight creak, and after that, the girl wanted to climb onto the windowsill in order to sit on it and look at the stars. The girl did just that. And thanks to that, the beautiful girl with short, blonde hair, who was the envy of everyone, sat on the windowsill with a jar. She also looked at the city before her eyes, which turned out to be very large, filled with tall buildings. But the lady at that time was not thinking about him or her studies, but about her mother. But when the girl was sadly worried about whether her mother would even recognize her after years, she heard the voice of a girl downstairs who was talking to someone about the fact that Kieran's marriage to Rosina would happen next month. Looking down and taking a closer look at the path under the house, the lady realized that she saw not only the red-haired lady, but also Milord. The protagonist's head immediately flashed with memories of how this very girl, as a child, had screamed at her with rage and was outraged by the accident of Claude's burn. At the same time, the charming and smiling Marilyn, who clearly liked Claude, was telling her future groom that if everything went well, they would be the next to get engaged. To the girl's words, Claude, calm and indifferent to the lady, responded that the best option for her father would be to find a groom who has the desire to be engaged. But when the guy told the red-haired aristocrat that there were enough good men in the empire who were seeking Marilyn's favor, the lady was seriously surprised, fell silent. Claude's words became like cracks in her soul. And that's why she got angry, lowered her eyes, and confessed to her fiancé that no man could compare to him. The brunette didn't even take offense and didn't stop Marilyn when she turned away from him in an offended manner and walked away, thanking him for taking her there, and she also admitted that she hoped that Claude would invite her to dance next time. And the main character looked at this, as if at a performance, silently watching as the red-haired lady quickly walked forward, while Claude himself stood and said nothing to the bride. And Camellia at that time thought that it seemed she saw something she shouldn't have looked. A few minutes later, the golden-haired lady decided to go down from the balcony and close the windows because she grabbed one of the doors with her hand, while holding a jar of candy unsteadily in her other hand. The girl did not expect at all that her clumsiness and weakness would play a cruel joke on her, because one awkward movement would lead to a fall, and the open jar of candies could already tip over. All the sweets could fall out. The blonde shuddered in surprise and wanted to grab the jar with her hands, but she could barely do it. And when she realized with horror, all she could do was desperately and astonishedly shout to Claude to be careful, which, noticing them, the brunette was incredibly surprised, as if he saw a candy rain in front of him, from which, speechless, he looked at this miracle, no less surprised by the sudden appearance of the main character. The shocked lady looked at Claude and hoped that her sweets would not harm the guy. But in the end, everything— And when the girl wanted to quickly apologize to the guy, trying to find the right words, but her attempts turned into stuttering, the brunette looked at the girl with a smile and charismatically said that he finally found— However, immediately after this, the main character's windows slammed shut so hard and quickly that Claude didn't even have time. While the worried and shocked Claude did not understand what came over Camillus, the main character walked around the room anxiously and wondered if the brunette would follow her, and also hoped that due to the large number of rooms, he simply would not be able to find her bedroom. But when she looked closely at her underwear, which had been lying on the floor all this time, she realized that in this situation she should not be afraid. She remembered how closely she had been watching the entire scene between Marilyn and Claude, realizing that she had to apologize not only for the candies that had fallen on Claude, but after that, the golden-haired girl sighed heavily and lowered her head, telling herself that even her apologies wouldn't help fix the situation because she dropped the lollipops on his head. However, while the main character was hard at work thinking about what to do, her bedroom door slowly opened and she looked with surprise and with her underwear in her hands at the one who entered. Because the man's voice playfully asked the lady, the same guy began to slowly walk towards the main character, confidently telling her that he knew that Camillus was brave enough for him to throw. The dark-haired guy calmly looked at the girl, and most likely, because of the darkness, he could not make out the silhouette of the golden-haired lady immediately turned away from Claude and answered embarrassedly that it happened by accident, and the girl, introducing herself as a guy, asked the guy for forgiveness. But she didn't even think that it wouldn't end there, because the dark-haired guy suddenly began to leisurely wander around the room, gradually heading towards the sofa and as if ignoring the words of the inner. And while Claude was about to sit down on the sofa in order to finally talk to the girl alone, the lady was anxiously thinking about the fact that she needed to get rid of the corset, and so she quietly threw it on the floor behind her back, telling Claude at the same time that she had been. To this, Claude responded with a smile, looking at Camillus and telling him that he was sitting there, that he had an upset stomach and while the girl was answering the guy with displeasure, saying that all she needed to do was eat the bitter medicine with something sweet, she quietly threw the corset away from her. However, when Claude suddenly became more serious, looking closely at the girl and saying her male name, the protagonist became nervous, already afraid that the brunette suspected something was wrong and would now reveal all her secrets. The girl was literally shaking with fear and asked the aristocrat what he needed, but he only silently tapped his palm on the sofa, hinting that Camellia should sit next to him, and this made the heroine even more wary. While the main character was sure that at such a close distance the guy would reveal her main secret, Claude remained calm and persistent. Because he ordered the girl, she decided to turn away and touch her forearms out of embarrassment, saying that she could hear him perfectly well from there, also wondering what the strange Claude was trying to achieve. The lady, with sadness on her face and with each passing minute, when Claude silently looked at her more and more intently, became upset and thought that the aristocrat had noticed her. The girl looked at Claude with fear and apprehension when he asked her to come closer, which made the protagonist even more afraid that the strict Claude would reveal all her secrets, and then she wouldn't even know what to do or how to explain herself. The brunette with his head down was still sitting on the couch and explained to the frightened girl that there was something he had to check, and the guy also sighed. Then Claude looked at Camellia with angry eyes, dissatisfied and irritated, asking her like. The girl was slightly confused and raised her eyebrows in embarrassment, trying to explain to the guy that everything was wrong. And after that, the thing is, Claude suddenly warned Camillus to beware of Prince Wade, which made the golden-haired teenager think and try to understand what was wrong, and when the girl asked the guy what he meant, Claude, imagining the prince surrounded by others, said that Prince Wade is a great admirer of beauty, and he does not even pay attention to gender, origin, whether a person is an aristocrat or an ordinary villager. But the protagonist still did not understand Claude's words, because she heard such things about him for the first time, which is why she looked at him with doubts, saying that she doesn't understand anything. But the brunette in front of her continued to insist on his own. He sat on the sofa and with folded hands told the girl not to smile in front of the prince so often, but rather not to hide behind the guards and keep a large distance from the prince. But the lady still did not understand what all this was. However, when the guy also confidently told the girl that his voice, like a boy, bewitches absolutely everyone, and this will only make the prince want. But after that, the heroine, who felt some kind of joke in Claude's words, looked at him with a playful expression. The thing is that the protagonist was looking intently at the body of the young aristocrat, or rather, at his legs, which were pumped up and big, which made it easy to. And the brunette's appearance itself, including his toned body, dressed in an expensive dark suit, looked wonderful, which is why the lady thought that Claude himself needed to be wary of admirers, because he had a rare and aristocratic beauty. That's exactly what she decided to ask the guy, looking at his handsome, thoughtful face, asking if he was worried about himself, because he was no less handsome. The golden-haired woman looked away and began to tell the guy on the couch that he was the most handsome man she had ever met. And after such a confession, Camellia killed the gentleman too. The girl didn't understand what was wrong with her and why everything was getting stranger and stranger with each passing minute, until she grabbed the candlestick in her hands to light the— Hiding behind the wall with the candlestick, the lady felt incredible cold for herself, from which she even clenched her teeth and tried to understand how she managed to say such words without— In the dark bedroom, Claude, who was sitting, was laughing almost to tears, and with small blushes on his face, he asked Camelius why he decided to play with him and constantly ran away. He even shouted to Camelius with a laugh, saying that if he was so afraid of the dark, he could go into the bath with him. But the indignant lady, hearing this, looked out of the doorway and refused. But when the main character left, she gave the brunette the opportunity to take a better look at the room, and thanks to this, he noticed the protagonist's shirt on the floor, which he began to stare at intently, as if Claude wanted not only to look at the heroine's thing, but also to pick it up from the floor, which she did, realizing that the shirt didn't even look like a man's, because it was quite light, which made the guy think, realizing that it was strange. He knelt down in front of the lady's shirt and also concluded that it was small, quite petite, and that such a thing would not fit on an ordinary guy of Camelius's age. It would be tight. What surprised the guy even more was that the shirt was not just a simple piece of clothing for Camelius, but a thing that even had an unusual smell. Or rather, the clothes smelled of pleasant lavender. This made the brunette smile and look at Camelius's shirt with pleasant thoughts, realizing that even the guy's smell was something interesting and magical for him, and he no longer hid from himself the fact that he liked the short-haired blonde. The room was dark, and only the moonlight from the windows allowed Claude to look around, holding Camelius's shirt in his hands and thinking about what would happen next, and how long the blonde had gone to the bathroom for. And while the brunette was thinking only about Camelius, the main character herself was in the bathroom for a long time. After some time, she still came out of the bath with a towel on her shoulders, looking at it and enjoying the cleanliness and pleasant smell from her body, not noticing that it had— And when the lady took a couple of steps, she immediately noticed a large amount of light in her room, which made the girl look around curiously, wanting to understand where Claude had gone and why her dark bedroom had suddenly lit up. Looking to the side, Camellia quickly realized that all the light came from the large number of candles in the room. But what surprised her most was that the maids in her room were still light. Noticing the brunette leaving her bedroom and walking down the hallway, the golden-haired lady walked out of the room and looked at the guy, asking if he was leaving, causing Claude to turn to the Protonwide as if— The brunette replied that it was indeed time for him to go, which caused the lady to thoughtfully reply that everything was clear then. Suddenly, for Claude, Camellia smiled in front of him and, putting his hand on her cleavage, said, "Well, in that case, hope that he will enjoy the rest of the evening without him, and the night will be calm, quiet, and the strange behavior of the heroine made Claude feel irritated for a moment. But he still decided to turn away from the one who had momentarily made him feel embarrassed, gesturing with his hand and saying as if the boy should not eat too many sweets. Otherwise, his sick stomach would never get better. And after that, Claude, having said goodbye to Camellia in silence, walked down the corridor and thereby forced the girl to follow him with a displeased look, because she remained silent and looked at Claude as if she didn't like his attention and strange behavior anymore. And with each passing day, she saw him as an increasingly suspicious aristocrat, albeit a handsome one. However, the brunette, who always tried not to get attached to anyone and to be alone, turned to the girl as if he still wanted something. And all for the reason that at the moment of farewell, the guy did not look at the protagonist's face or into her eye. He asked himself out loud, wondering if Camelius had suddenly decided that he would enjoy the late evening. As if the boy's wish had sounded strange and Claude was trying to find something special in every word Camelius had said. The next day, when Kieran was already dressed nicely in a men's uniform and looked out the window with a smile because it was snowing there, he thought that the spring snowstorm looked beautiful and magical, and only thanks to the weather his mood improved. Also in the room with him on a light sofa sat a certain guy who seemed to be sleeping with a red book on his face. But Kieran kept talking to him about the weather, and also about the fact that he had already been in this place for 4 years. He looked at his fist with sad eyes and sometimes unclenched it, confessing to his friend with a book that the weather in these surroundings never ceased to amaze him. And the one who was supposed to listen to his friend didn't even answer him or even agree with his words, because he was still sitting with a book on his face when Kieran tried to wake up his interlocutor named Ian. Only when Kieran said to his friend with displeasure whether he should return to his place in the Oki, since he was already starting to get bored, did he remove the kingu from his face and show the golden-haired boy his snow-white hair, reminiscent of snow or smoke. First, Ian stretched, which caused him to raise his hands up and tell Kieran that he didn't even know what to tell him, yawning as the other aristocrat looked at him with slight irritation. And after the blonde man with snow-white eyes, skin and eyebrows looked charismatically at Kieran, asking him if this was— But after some time of conversation, Kieran suddenly gave Ian a letter, because of which the white-haired guy looked at his friend with bewilderment and asked what it— The blonde looked at the letter with an assa seal with suspicion, turning it in different directions, and also asked his friend why he didn't ask his mother to send this letter, because he was sending it to his house, and Lady Bale would get there much faster than he did. To this, Kieran calmly answered the guy, looking at him, saying that he had already asked her to send his sheets to the house. In response, the blonde man with snow-white hair only smiled and asked Kieran if this was so, because it seemed to him that Lady Bale did not want anyone to hear any news about him, as if he himself was a secret here. As it turned out, the blonde imagined a beautiful lady with golden words in his head, telling Kieran that by the words about someone he meant his own sister, who has an angelic appearance and about whom he talks so much. Hearing this from the smiling Ian, Kieran's soul only became sadder, which is why he looked down and said with a sigh, like, "It seems like he's telling the truth, and his mother—" And suddenly, when Kieran no longer hoped that the prince would help him, he smiled slyly and began gesturing with his hand, telling the cold-haired guy. But what surprised the green-eyed boy even more was that John promised to deliver the letter not to his mother or anyone else, but to Kieran's sister Kamalia herself, so that this time the letter would not be stolen and as soon as he shouted out Jan's name in shock in order to try to say something to him one last time, he noticed that his friend, who had been sitting on the chair a second ago, had already disappeared somewhere, leaving behind only a barely noticeable— Kieran was shocked by the speed of the blonde and his disappearance, that he began to turn his head with his mouth open, hearing behind him the creaking sounds of the window door opening slightly, which everything turned out as Kieran had expected, because the blonde decided not to use the door to run out of the room, but used a more spectacular and dangerous method, since he was already climbing onto the bench and was about to fall down like an acrobat. Kieran could only shout Ian's name in shock and try to stop him, but it was too late to do anything, because the prince's toned body was completely— The blonde smiled at this as if extreme sports always helped him feel a surge of strength, so he didn't even pay attention to Kieran, but smiled so sincerely as if he could already meet the golden-haired boy peered out of the window at John and watched with a shocked face as his friend whistled away with a letter in his hands. And while he was wondering if he was going to meet Camellia right now, he didn't expect to meet a member of his family. The thing is that Ian knew that any minute his mother would appear, who was already taking off her hat and greeting her son, which is why— And while the golden-haired prince looked at his mother, who had arrived with surprise, she calmly looked around the room and asked Kieran how he was feeling, lifting the red book from the chair and telling him that she already understood that the prince had been here. At this time, Kieran was already calmly closing the window, because it was snowing outside and he didn't want to seem strange to his mother, smiling and telling her that it seemed that Jan had urgent business. But this did not please Stacy, who was still looking for suspicious things in the room and did not trust her son, saying that of course this is good, and they consider each other friends. But she hinted that Kieran should not forget that the prince is their personal enemy. Stacy explained to her son that they should not trust everyone and asked him not to get involved with the suspicious prince anymore, which caused a calm Kieran to close the window and say that he would do so, although he no longer trusted his own mother. But when Kieran headed towards the exit of the room and said that he wanted to go to the library and therefore would leave her alone, Stacy did not like this, and she told her. To this, Kieran responded with a smile, telling his sad mother that this was not so and that he simply wanted to return home a better person than before, which was why he wanted to read more books. Stacy didn't like Kieran's answer, so she continued to stand silently in front of the window and look at her son as if she already understood that he was not telling him something. And the previous warm relationship with him was gradually becoming cold and distant, as if they were enemies to each other. After such strange events, several days passed, and in the palace with the red roof, everything was still calm and magical. The garden was well-groomed and beautiful, and in the multi-story building itself, the main character was still there, The thing is, the protagonist with short golden hair looked at her main maid with a smile and said that she and Pippi wanted to go to the city again, which made the butler look at Behind Camellia was the red-haired Pippi, who was much more shy and therefore looked at the floor while the head maid doubted their decision. The brown-haired lady, holding a large sheet in her hands, looked at the couple strangely and suspiciously and asked them if they had already been in the city a few days ago. And to this, Camellia replied that it had been just a couple of days ago, and they wanted to go again. It seems that the golden-haired lady began to come up with reasons for the trip for the maid, because she told her with a smile about a pen she liked in the city. And while Pippi was keeping Camellia talking and saying, well, that's it, Betty was calmly unrolling the sheet and tucking it in, telling both of them, but then the girl began to pretend and lie even more, scratching her head and telling Betty that she was afraid that all the pens had already been sold out and therefore wanted to buy something else, similar to this stationery. And when Betty told Pippi and Camellia that ice cream was also sold in their house, they both couldn't stand it and shouted that the dessert here was completely different and they wanted the city one, which is why the Garincha had to give in. Realizing that Pippi and the heroine insisted, she sighed and said that in that case, prepare a carriage for them and also asked them to be careful, because frequent trips around the city in an aristocratic carriage could attract the attention of bad people and thieves. The noblewoman, concerned for the life of Pippi and Carelia, said that attacks on noblewomen have become popular recently, which has left them so shocked that they simply screamed, and she even said that the most common weapon for robbers is a nod with a long blade, which men can use to threaten, injure, or even— And Betty folded her arms, turned to Camellia, and said that everyone already knows that she is a boy and looks like a guy, but because of her femininity, she can— But as soon as Betty turned her head in the direction where she had last seen Camellia and Pippi, she suddenly realized that her girls had disappeared. Because the maid's permission to go to town had— Everything turned out as Betty had expected, because when she was in the palace shouting Camelius's name with displeasure and behind her, Pippi was laughing, and was only too happy to have a good time with the aristocrat, and, even more so, to go somewhere where they felt good and interesting. While the main character and her maid were already anticipating new entertainment in the city, in a completely different place, next to a high palace decorated with ornaments, there were guards with sharp spears. Everything turned out to be exactly like that, because in one of the dark bedrooms, on the bed lay a large and incredibly weak Marilyn with red hair, who was sighing heavily, as if she had been feeling so bad for more than one day. It seems that the girl was attacked by those whom Betty told the main character about, the robbers, because of whom Marilyn's mother was now on her knees in front of one guy, asking him to punish all those who did this to her daughter. But the aristocrat in white was silent. This man turned out to be Prince Wade, who was upset by the situation with Marilyn, and therefore looked at the mother of the injured woman with a serious face and said that after this, he turned away from Marilyn's mother and walked back, telling her not to worry because the evildoers would be punished. And he promised her this, causing the woman to kneel behind him and thank him and continue to bow. Prince Wei came out of the room and immediately looked at the person who was standing near the open draft. He had a dark blue suit and stood with his hands folded, helping the prince to understand that this was his close friend named Claude. Looking at his friend, who was also the future groom of the injured Marilyn, the prince silently looked at the brunette, who, it seemed, was not very sad about the situation, looked calm and ordinary. After a while, they both decided to take a walk in the garden, and the prince walked behind Claude and told him that Claude even imagined a suspect, the one who attacked the shocked Marilyn, saying that the suspect was a member of a revolutionary faction that wanted to overthrow the empire and the monarchy. The prince continued to follow Claude and asked him why the criminals had decided to target Marilyn specifically, and then the other one calmly replied that perhaps the emperor would like to keep Marilyn's family company because it would help calm everyone down. Hearing this, the prince became indignant, asking Claude if he should not have taken up this job and calmed his future bride. To this, Claude gave no answer because he quickly found himself near his red transport and bowed to the prince, telling him that in that case they would see each other at the academy, which he would very much look forward to. The prince could only watch as the magician of Milord Claude left, and out of anger, the prince clearly wanted to say something to his friend and even thought that one day he would remind him of this moment. But for now, he was only thinking about the terrible situation that happened, and Claude himself sat silently in the car and looked at the city views. The local people who were well-dressed and walking along the road, looking at the tall buildings and nature. and Claude looked at them, realizing that many of them could be criminals or the same villains. Also, the silent Claude, who was looking at the girls with folded hands, understood that every day the city was really becoming unsafe even for aristocrats. He looked at the women with sweet faces, who wore pink dresses, lush and beautiful, who smiled at him and were only glad to see an aristocrat in the city. But Claude did not smile, because all this made him remember the one. Looking at the sweets in the women's hands, the guy remembered that shocked moment when the main character's lollipops rained down on him from the third floor, and he was ready to lose the power of speech. At that moment, he was no less amazed that he met Camillus at such an unusual moment, which is why he was able to examine his appearance, a frightened and worried look, as if he was already worried about the consequences of what happened. And with a slight grin on his face, which appeared because of the memories of the candies, the milord rode on transport through the city, while some of the townspeople looked at him and went about their business. At the moment when Claude was thinking about Camillus and leaving, Pippi was in another store and cheerfully asked the main character what was wrong. The thing is that the girl looked at the view from the shop window in surprise and told Pippi with fascination that she seemed to have spotted a familiar face among the crowd of strangers for a moment, which amazed her. But Pip was only interested in shopping with the aristocrat, so she asked Camillus with delight and joy if they were going somewhere to buy sweets. She leaned forward with the same cheerfulness and asked Camillus if they really had come for the pen, to which he replied that it was true, which was why Pippi. Then the girl decided to confess to the maid and answer with a thoughtful look that she was actually thinking about clothes, which she wanted to buy more than all. Hearing this, the red-haired lady looked at the aristocrat with curiosity and tilted her head to the side, asking Camellia why they didn't go to the tailor. And the heroine replied that she had promised earlier to pick out a dress for her when they arrived at the cap. And so, in order to keep her promise, the golden-haired lady said that now they would go and choose a dress for her. And they both noticed a beautiful red and white dress that was in the store across the road. After a while, they both actually found themselves in the right clothing store, where there were other ladies in cute hats and colorful dresses, who were talking about their own things while the main character also looked at the hats with a smile and wondered whether they would suit her or whether they would look better on Pippi. After a while, the golden-haired Lee approached Pippi and politely asked her if she could rely on her, while the maid herself was delighted and said, "Do everything. Just pick out a chic." And even when the aristocrat hinted to her that she had enough money to buy a good dress, showing her a bag of gold coins, Pippi shook her hands and said that Betty had already given her the necessary amount, and therefore this made Camellia feel good, and she smiled, realizing that Betty had already taken care of them in advance. And now, most likely, she was worried in the castle. The girl sometimes held different hats in her hands and looked at them, but she was even more attracted by other visitors to the store, who were dressed in beautiful women's clothes and laughed. She noticed that they were not only beautifully dressed, but also wore what they wanted, showing their taste, grace, and femininity, which made the protagonist truly envious of them. The lady felt as if she were alone, still holding her hat as if that was her true desire, and not to be in men's clothes even at home, which constricted her and did not allow her to feel who she really was. But suddenly, when the golden-haired lady thought about it, she heard someone call her by her real name, more precisely, Lady Camellia, which instantly surprised her, realizing that the unknown gentleman had already learned her main secret, which also immediately caught, and she immediately turned towards the one who said these words in a playful and charismatic voice. In front of her, the stunned Gurnia noticed a blonde man in a luxurious aristocratic robe, who looked at her with a smile and said that he had keen eyesight, and that was why he continued to stand in front of her as if he didn't even need confirmation from the pro-acnoid, and she was shocked by this. Looking at the prince with big eyes and with excitement in her voice, telling him that he was most likely mistaken, she raised her hand to her chin and began to ask the girl if she was Kier's sister, because he immediately saw an incredible similarity between her and the aristocrat, which was noticeable even from afar. The girl in front of him immediately understood that it would not be possible to deceive him, and therefore she became even more scared. She asked the blonde who he was, and the lady's face did not lose its surprise when Ian said that he was just the one who was going to invite her to try an excellent fruit dessert nearby, and did not say his name or stus. He leaned towards the girl and, with a laugh and a smile on his face, said that he would be her most devoted friend if Camellia wanted it. But the golden-haired lady was so shocked that she could not utter an answer. Sometime after such a strange incident, the heroine still decided to spend time with the one who called her by her real name, and therefore she was on a beautiful, busy street, where there are also many. Camellia sat silently at the table and sometimes did not even look at the prince. But then he in turn looked at the lady and smiled as if he had invited her not for a conversation, but for an appointment, already anticipating an interesting conversation with an equally interesting heroine. Yan was also hot, which is why he leaned back in his chair and told the protagonist that it was stuffy in the room, after which he suggested going outside. But the golden-haired lady said that he would have to put up with it. But his clothes, as it turned out, were not quite summer ones. She looked more closely at the prince's clothes, or rather at his fur with a thick layer of uniform. The girl quickly understood why the guy was stuffy, and also, thanks to hearing from Camellia that his clothes were distinctive, the blonde laughed heartily and said that his clothes were still good. But her attempts to dress like a man looked ridiculous, which caught the protagonist's attention and made her outraged. She angrily shouted at the prince, saying that she was a guy, also addressing herself in the mud gender and telling him that most likely her interlocutor had fallen for a joke from her older brother. Then the girl decided to sigh heavily, remembering her brother, whom she missed and worried about, and so she began to ask the gentleman how Kieran was doing now and whether everything was okay with him. Ian calmly told the heroine that everything was fine with Kieran now, and he was still on the surface. But he was also constantly waiting for a letter from his younger sister, and was now upset because he had not received at least one telegram, and the lady, hearing this, became wary. The girl answered honestly, talking about herself as a boy and admitting to the prince that she had never received letters from him, to which the blonde said that it was not surprising. Imagining Kieran sitting at the table and diligently writing another and another letter, the prince told the protagonist that he wrote a new letter each time, but when the guy with white hair and cunning intentions looked at the girl and said these words to her, the protagonist looked at him with both shock and indignation. As expected, the main character pushed the prince's hand with a spoon of strawberry ice cream away from her with her hand, turning away from him with displeasure and saying that he should stop calling her by a female name. Even when the white-haired prince once again called the girl Camellia, she got angry and spoke about herself only in the masculine gender, saying that it was. At that moment, the guy decided to stick a letter from Kieran out from under his clothes, looking at the girl with a charismatic smile and saying that then, the sad lady took the letter from her brother in her hand and began to think about the fact that he would really soon return from the north, which was confirmed by the aristocrat in front of her. And if he had fully recovered, she was afraid that the Bale family would no longer need her. In this, the main character saw the opportunity to become who she really is, or rather, to no longer pretend to be a. As a result, Prince Yang, with fur on his shoulders, looked at the girl who had been pretending to be a guy until now, but was silent because of sadness, although she was happy about her brother. However, at this moment, the blonde man with snow-white hair was not thinking about the lady's feelings or her actions, but about her beauty, because he considered her. Even when he addressed the heroine as a girl, calling her Camellia, the protagonist banged her fists on the table in displeasure and ordered him to call her Camelius, which made the prince laugh and still call her by a male name, intending to say something important. And the main character was very surprised that the aristocrat in front of her did not just smile and talk freely about something, but asked her permission to invite her to the kingdom of Gaior, his homeland, where he is one of the main noble people. He even took the girl by the hand and said in a pleasant voice that he would send her an invitation in the near future and therefore wished the lady to come to him as soon as possible, which he would be incredibly. In the end, having called the protagonist a lady, the prince leaned forward to kiss her hand, and this suddenly silenced Kalia, was so surprised that she watched John's action. As a result, the main character failed to deceive the cunning and clever prince, who initially found out everything she needed and provided her with a. Sometime after this strange event, the protagonist was already sitting at her desk and had a large amount of paper in front of her, because with her elbows on the table, she was thinking about how best to start a letter to her older brother. Sometimes she would lie down on the table and not know where to begin, because she had never written a letter before. And if she had not been adopted into an aristocrat, but suddenly her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed that someone appeared in front of her, who placed a plate of cookies in front of her, which the lady dared to take with curiosity. This person turned out to be the maid Betty, who stood in front of the main character with a serious face. And because of this, Camellia questioningly said her name, as if asking. After a long silence, Betty finally started the conversation by saying that Pippi personally told her that Camellia gave her 5 dresses. But this caused more questions from the main character, as if asking them. Betty was also about to sit down at the table and then pushed her chair back, telling the lady with displeasure. She also heard that the main character ate ice cream with a certain foreigner with a strange hair color. And when the golden-haired lady wanted to explain everything with a smile, Betty interrupted her again. She cried out that she and Pippi had set out without her, and that therefore the usual journey to the city was even more dangerous. And when she heard about the stranger and this is exactly what the maid wanted to talk about with the protagonist, sitting with her at the table and asking Camellia if they heard about the case of Marilyn, because Betty leaned her head forward in excitement and told the heroine once again that she needed to be more careful. And the maid only fell silent when Camellia said that she just wanted to thank Pippi for agreeing to go with her to the capital, which made the brown-haired woman look away sadly. Camellia, who, unlike the maid, was calm and sweet, looked at Betty with a smile and said that now Pippi would have to try on many beautiful dresses, even though it cost them a risk. Then the maid finally sighed and lowered her head, realizing that all her complaints and comments were powerless in front of the man who simply loved her and wanted to spend time with joy and interest. Taking the teapot in her hands, she told Camellia that she always manages to beat her in arguments, which made the protagonist laugh, realizing that Betty's anger had gone away, and she was no longer angry with her. But then the golden-haired lady decided to talk about something else, looking at the maid with interest and a smile and asking Betty how Stacy managed to find her. But as soon as Betty heard such a question, her hands shook and the teapot with which she was pouring the drink into the cup clinked and was about to fall out of her hands, which only indicated that the maid was clearly worried. After that, Betty calmly poured tea into a cup and quarreled with the girl, asking her why she was asking her such a question, and the heroine looked at her with experience in response. The maid handed the hot drink to the lady while the race called her, saying that she had recently been in the capital and turned out to be much larger than she had previously thought. So she asked the maid how Stacy managed to find her in such a huge city. The lady began her suspicious story by looking away and smiling doubtfully, saying that a long time ago, one of the palace workers had met Laura, the Guarini's mother, earlier. The golden-haired lady picked up a cup of tea and asked the lady if she could tell who it was. But Betty, who was sitting in front of him, replied that he no longer worked here. Hearing this, the girl became sad and sighed with sorrow in her soul, saying that now everything was clear to her. But sometimes she still wondered why in this life she had to go through this. She had already looked out the window with a cup of tea in her hands and asked the maid directly why she had been chosen to play the role of Kieran's younger brother. But Betty remained silent, realizing that she could not answer such questions. The maid looked at the girl with both understanding and sadness, realizing that she would never in her life have thought that she would have to raise and looking at the devastated Camellia, who was still interested in her mother and how she was separated from her home and brought to a beautiful house where her stepmother hates her, and others must. The maid decided to break the silence after a few minutes and sadly tell the girl that Lord Kieran's poor health had always brought suffering to Stacy and Gillard. Their family had always been a reason for ridicule and rumors, discussions. Imagining a sick Kieran, who even as a child lay in bed and coughed, which made Stacy and Gillard think about other. At that moment, Stacy seemed to be alone, holding little Kieran with her while her relatives were around her, insisting that she take their. Stacy realized that she was surrounded only by those who wanted to benefit from her son's illness, and so she decided to find the main character, make her a boy, and thereby protect herself from deception. But suddenly, Camellia jumped up from the table and told Betty that in that case, the whole family could easily get rid of her, which was her greatest fear. But when the maid tried to say that all this was not so, the golden-haired lady only. The main character, completely confident that she will be disposed of like a toy after Kieran recovers, laughs in the maid's face with Allah, saying that her older brother will return very soon and then everything in her life will change, and some things will even end. The girl told the maid that thanks to her brother, he would be able to return to his former poor life. And when the lady wanted to continue her painful story, Betty nervously clenched her hands into fists. With complete confidence, the girl took a dump in the maid's face and said that she was not just going to pretend to be a boy and continue. Several hours had passed since then, and the maid and Camellia had interrupted their heated discussion on a sharp note. But when the maid reappeared in the lady's chambers and realized that she could not find her, she began to look around and grab Camellia. And the woman did not expect at all that the protagonist, full of determination to act, was no longer even in the door, but was running from it with all her might, which is why the shocked Betty shouted the girl's male name, hoping that she would respond. But the maid was not going to put up with this because she looked at the running lady with shock and indignation. Betty tried to stop the protagonist by saying that swimming in the lake was strictly prohibited because she might get sick. But this did not stop the girl, who had already left her shoes on. Soon, Camellia dove into the water with such force that the spray rose up and made a characteristic noise, which is why Betty had to quickly go down and run to the girl, helping her out of the water. The girl wanted to feel the water with her whole body so much that she dived into it and curled up into a ball until her clothes were soaked to the skin. Air bubbles rose up, and the lady felt. After being in the water for a few seconds, the girl rose from it and emerged, taking a deep breath and not even paying attention to them. She liked the nature even more, which surrounded the shallow lake, namely the trees with lush bushes that blossomed their flowers, decorated the garden, and allowed birds to sit on the branches, which in turn sang. She relaxed her body and began to float on the surface of the water, looking up at the sky and thinking that she still wanted to leave this place behind, returning to her old life, where she could certainly be herself and meet her mother. But still something was holding her here. But as soon as the heroine heard strange steps behind her and the voice of a guy she knew, she instantly turned around, being waist-deep in water. The fact is that a smiling Claude was sitting comfortably on the lounger, closely watching the main character and sometimes laughing at her behavior. The one who was most surprised by the guy's appearance was the golden-haired protagonist, whose jaw dropped from Claude's suddenness. But at that moment, he only laughed slyly and said that this was all incredibly interesting. He looked at the heroine's appearance, her wet clothes and hair with mesmerizing eyes, calling Camelius an interesting guy and tilting his head to the side, as if he only liked all of this. And while the girl looked at him not only with shock, but also with incredible anxiety, Claude calmly got up from the lounger and asked the supposed. The girl immediately asked Claude why he was here and how he got here, which made her look at Betty, suspecting that she was to blame for all this. But even when the golden-haired lady anxiously explained to Claude that Kieran was returning tomorrow or the day after, the brunette answered her that he knew about it, which made the heroine even more wary, not understanding what Claude was doing here and what he needed. And the main character did not expect at all that Claude, with the words that he also wants to have fun and swim in the lake, would throw off his shirt and throw it on the grass, while the protagonist would be shocked and ask him what he. A second later, the girl with a red face was already looking at Claude's naked torso, covering her own body with her hands so that the guy would not notice her corset through her wet shirt, because its transparency makes it easy to see that. And the girl was blushing for a reason, because Claude's body turned out to be no less attractive and beautiful than he himself. Because broad shoulders, large. Camellia didn't even have time to look at Claude, because the guy immediately dove into the water with the same force as she did, which is why the heroine had to cover herself with her hands from the splashes and turn away from them. However, this was not all for her, because suddenly the aristocrat appeared right behind her and began to straighten his wet hair, telling the lady to think about the fact that today was the day when they would swim. The shocked and unexpected lady raised her head up with her lips parted, not even believing that this had happened and already preparing to blush even more from embarrassment. The lady immediately moved away from Claude, still waist-deep in water and covering her breasts with her palms, constantly turning her head to the side with anxious thoughts that Claude was about to notice her corset through her wet shirt. And she decided to do the first thing that came to her mind, which is why she dove under the water, breathing air into her mouth. But when the girl was swimming underwater and wanted to quickly escape from the handsome Claude, she did not expect at all that he would grab her by the wrist, which would make the lady scared and surprised at the same time. Turning around, the curious camellia saw Claude, who still hadn't let her go and even in the water looked into her eyes, as if he understood that the golden-haired lady would want to get away from him as soon as possible. What struck her even more was that the guy not only looked at her with his blue eyes, but also smiled so sincerely and sweetly that blushing and, at the same time, jerking her hand so that the guy would let go, the heroine immediately released air from shock. At that very moment, the heroine emerged from the water almost like a dolphin, greedily inhaling air again, which could shock the maid, who was watching. She, with a prepared towel in her hands and with astonished eyes, looked at the aristocrat and called her by a man's name, worried that the girl, because she got out of the water as fast as she could, coughing up water and still feeling shocked and confused about the guy pulling her down with him. But at that moment, she heard Claude's charismatic voice behind her saying that he thought Camillus was a good swimmer. The shocked girl turned to Claude and said with extreme indignation that he had just pulled her to the bottom. But this only made the guy smile, and he replied that he would give the heroine another chance to learn to. She turned away from him and said to herself in the masculine gender, displeased, that she would leave him, after which she went closer to the maid, forcing the guy to shut up. Claude stood waist-deep in the water and watched the heroine closely, while she, feeling irritated after what had happened, took the towel from Betty's hands to warm up and sit by the shore. But at that, the girl was even more surprised when she threw a towel over herself and noticed Claude relaxing on the red blanket. He was not looking at her and was simply basking in the sun, but he already wanted to be near the girl if she no longer wanted to swim. And the protagonist was even more outraged by the fact that when she was looking at him angrily, Claude asked the girl to come over, because now they both needed to rest in the warm sun, which the guy said again with a sly grin on his face.